In the early 2000s, a teenager named Evan and his father had a shared passion. It was hunting. But more than that, it was just being out in the woods together, away from everything. They spent countless weekends in the Georgia backcountry, and it was their thing. When Evan turned 14, something really special happened. His father had become friends with a very wealthy man, a landowner in Georgia who owned a massive, pristine piece of property. And this man offered them something incredible, exclusive access to one of his best private hunting areas. Just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Evan and his dad decided to take him up on the offer. They woke up before the sun, the air still cool and damp. The truck was already packed. They drove for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into the rural parts of the state until they finally reached the edge of the property. It was completely fenced in, just as the owner had said. They pulled up to a big, sturdy main gate. Evan's dad pulled a slip of paper from his pocket with the combination code the owner had given them. He punched in the numbers, and with a heavy click, the lock released. They swung the gate open, drove the truck through, and then got out to shut and lock it behind them. The sound of the gate locking echoed a little. It was a strange feeling being locked inside this huge expanse of land. But it also felt secure, like they had the whole world to themselves. They got back in the truck and started down a long, winding access road. They followed this dirt path for about 2 miles, kicking up dust behind them. The road finally came to a stop at the edge of a huge, dense forest. This was it. They parked the truck, killed the engine, and the world went completely silent. They got out, stretched their legs, and started putting on their gear. In the pre-morning darkness, with only the faint light of dawn filtering through the trees, they began their hike into the woods. Now, even though they were there to hunt, Evan and his father secretly loved just hiking and camping. They'd take any chance they could to extend their trips, even if the hunting wasn't great. They were comfortable in the woods. They knew its sounds, its rhythms, its life. And so, almost as soon as they stepped under the canopy of trees in this particular forest, they both noticed something was very, very wrong. There were no birds chirping. There were no squirrels chattering or rustling in the leaves. There were no animals at all. It was just silent. A deep, unnatural silence. The only sound they heard that wasn't made by their own footsteps was the distant hum of a single airplane passing high overhead. They stopped for a moment and just listened. Nothing. Evan looked at his dad, who just shrugged. They found it incredibly odd, but they tried to reason it away. You know, this is private property, they thought. Not a lot of people are ever out here. The animals probably heard the truck or heard us talking and just scattered. It made sense, sort of. They eventually made it to the hunting stand the owner had told them about. It was a good setup, high in a tree with a clear view of a small clearing. They got all settled in, got their rifles ready, and they waited. And waited. All day long, they didn't see a single deer, a single rabbit, not even a bird. They didn't hear anything either. The silence that had felt strange in the morning now felt heavy, almost oppressive, by the afternoon. Frustrated, they finally decided to call it a day. They began packing up their gear, making their way carefully down the ladder of the stand. They started looking around for a good place to make camp for the night. Evan's father had an idea. He turned to Evan and said, "Hey, there's obviously nothing happening over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods for a while? We can set up camp there, and then tomorrow we'll have a better chance of seeing some animals." It sounded like a good plan, so they started hiking. They walked for about an hour, pushing farther and farther away from their truck and the hunting stand. They eventually reached a small clearing that looked perfect for a campsite. So they dropped their packs and got to work. They set up their tent, a small dome tent they had used 1,000 times. Evan knew exactly how to do it. He slid the 2 flexible poles through the nylon loops, crossed them over the top, and then bent them to anchor each of the 4 ends into the little metal eyelets at the base of the tent. The tension is what held the whole thing up. With the tent set up and their gear stored inside, they realized they still had some daylight left. Evan's father looked at him and said, You want to go try our luck one more time? See if we can spot anything out here? Evan figured, why not? So they hiked a little ways away from their new campsite and set up a small hunting blind. And once again, they saw absolutely nothing. It was just as quiet and still as it had been all day. Defeated, they packed up the blind and started heading back to their tent. As they got closer, they could see their campsite through the trees. And right away, they saw something was wrong. Their tent, which they had just set up an hour ago, was now completely collapsed. Evan's father turned to him and said, "Oh, it must have been the wind." But Evan immediately shook his head. "No," he said, "it couldn't have been the wind. We've been talking all day about how quiet it is. There's been no wind, no weather at all. That's what's making the silence so creepy. It definitely wasn't the wind." So Evan's father looked at him, a little annoyed. "Well," he asked, "when you set the tent up, did you not put the posts into the eyelets? Did you not build it correctly?" Evan felt a flash of frustration. "No," he said, "I've set that tent up 1,000 times. I know it was set up correctly. We both saw it. We put our gear inside." They walked into their campsite and looked down at the flattened tent, and they were really confused by what they saw. The 2 long rods that cross over the top of the tent had been removed from the 4 corner anchor points. Now, if you know how these tents work, they're held up by tension. Once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just pop out. You have to physically bend the rod and pull it out of the anchor. It's actually a little difficult to do. Basically, for the tent to collapse like this, either the rods would have had to break, or someone would have had to come over and manually, deliberately pull all 4 ends of the rods out of their anchors, and they knew they didn't do it. And none of the rods were broken. This left them with 2 possibilities. Either they had both somehow failed to set up their tent correctly, even though they had clear memories of doing it and double-checking it because they put their sleeping bags and packs inside, or someone had come to their campsite while they were gone and collapsed their tent. They decided, you know what, it can't be some stranger. We're the only ones with the gate combination. This is private property. No one could have been here. And why would they do that? If someone did find our campsite, why would they just randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? It had to be us. We must have not set it up right. And even though they didn't really believe that, they convinced themselves that's what must have happened. Because the alternative was just too bizarre, and frankly, too terrifying to consider. So they built their tent again, making sure the rods were securely in place this time. They made a small fire and sat for a little while, chatting quietly as the sun went down. But they were both tired, and the strange day had worn them out. They decided to just go to bed. They carefully extinguished the fire, got into the tent, and both fell asleep. A couple of hours later, Evan woke up suddenly. He wasn't sure if he was dreaming or not, but he thought he heard someone laughing. It sounded like it was a couple 100 meters away, behind their tent, off in the woods. Evan instinctively turned to make sure his dad was still in the tent with him, and he was, sleeping soundly. Evan held his breath and started listening really intently to what was happening outside. And all he could hear was that same deep silence that had been there all day. He didn't hear any more laughter. He thought, okay, I must have just been dreaming. There wasn't any laughter out there. And eventually, Evan managed to fall back asleep. A little while later, Evan woke up suddenly again. Except this time, his dad was already awake, sitting up and looking around anxiously in the dark. Evan sat up and whispered, "What's going on?" And his dad just held up a hand and said, "Shh." Then he whispered, "Can you hear that?" Evan listened, and to his absolute horror, he heard it too. Laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Evan also realized the laughter wasn't coming from the same area he'd heard it the first time. It was now coming from the opposite direction, and it was a lot closer to them. Evan very quietly and carefully explained to his dad that he'd actually heard this same laughter a couple of hours earlier, but had thought it was a dream. Evan's father turned to him in the darkness, and his voice was tense. He said, before we came out here, I asked the owner specifically, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys. After this revelation, a cold dread settled over them. They both turned their attention back to just listening. They were hoping this was just going to stop, that whatever this was, it was just going to leave. But it didn't leave. Suddenly, they heard footsteps. They were running towards them from way off in the forest. It was so quiet out that it was really easy to hear the footsteps, the snapping of twigs, the pounding on the hard earth. And whatever this was, it was charging directly towards them. And then it came to a complete, sudden stop, right at the edge of their clearing. At this point, Evan was grabbing onto his father's arm. Evan's father was holding his rifle, getting ready to open the tent and confront whatever was out there. And right before he grabbed the zipper, this person, whatever it was, started laughing again. And it was practically right on top of them. It was so loud they could hear it clear as day, right there, just outside their tent. Evan's father took a deep breath. He grabbed the zipper of the tent door, and as soon as he began to move it, the small zipping sound it made caused the laughter to instantly stop. Dead silence. They didn't hear footsteps running away, so they knew something was probably still out there. But the laughter just cut off, as if it had recognized that they were making noise, that they were right there in the tent. Evan's father froze with his hand on the zipper. He was debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he could even make that decision, whatever this thing was, it turned around and ran back into the woods. They could hear the footsteps fading into the distance until it was just gone. And for several minutes, they just sat like that in total silence, praying that whatever this was, it was gone for good. After several long minutes, when they didn't hear anything else, no more laughing, no more running, Evan's father re-zipped the tent and put his hand back down. They were both left just sitting there in the dark, thinking, what in the world just happened? Evan and his father would stay awake all night. They barely spoke to each other. Whatever this thing was, it had heard them when they moved the zipper. So they were really afraid of making any sound at all, even little sounds, because it was so quiet that sound traveled really far. And they didn't know who or what was out there. So in silence, holding their guns, they just waited for the sun to come up. And as soon as the first light of dawn appeared, they were up and out of there. They didn't even pack the tent properly, they just stuffed it into a bag. They were practically running out of the forest, checking over their shoulders the whole time, all the way back to their truck. To this day, they have no idea who or what was running around out there. They told the owner of the property about it, and the owner just said it's not possible. He told them, we have a totally gated-in, private piece of property, and there are cameras watching the only entrance. You are the only ones that went in or out over that time period. And prior to that, we monitor the property. Nobody else was in there. In the summer of 2013, a young woman named Katie and her father decided to go camping at one of their favorite campgrounds high up in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Katie loved going camping with her father. He was this totally accomplished outdoorsman. He used to be a wilderness guide for much of his life, so she just always felt like she was in great hands whenever she was out in the wild with him. And because of him, she had become a fairly accomplished outdoorswoman herself. When they arrived at the campground, the parking lot was packed with cars. They looked at each other and thought, shoot, I wish we'd called ahead a couple of weeks ago to reserve a site. They're probably not even available now. But they went to the front desk at the ranger station, and the ranger told them they were in luck. He said they had one site available, but it was the one that was way over on the far end of the campground. It was this one specific campsite that was kind of isolated from all the rest. It was a long walk from the main bathhouse, it was far away from the lake where you'd go swimming, and it was a good distance from the parking lot. It was just really inconvenient. Whenever they came camping here in the past, it was the one site they always hoped they wouldn't get. But beggars can't be choosers. They were just happy to have a site at all, so they took it. They drove all the way down this little dirt road to this very isolated campsite tucked away in the middle of the forest. Once they got there, they began setting up their respective tents. They weren't going to be staying in the same one. They each had these very small one-person backpacking tents. They were so small that you had a choice to make. You could either zip it up all the way to stay warmer and more protected from bugs, but you had to sleep curled up in a ball because your legs wouldn't fit otherwise. Or you could unzip the front flap of your tent, and when you lay down, you could extend your legs fully, but your legs would be protruding outside of your tent. You could only really do that in warmer weather, and if you were comfortable having your legs poking out into the wilderness. After they got their tent set up, they got their coolers situated, and they had all their stuff kind of the way they wanted it, they went out hiking for the rest of the day. When they came back that evening, they were totally exhausted. They ate a quick dinner, got into their tents, and fell asleep pretty much immediately. Nothing of note happened over that first night. The next day, they got up, had breakfast, and went back out hiking all day all over again. They came back that night, and they were completely exhausted once more. They got into their tents and went to bed. And this night, something of note would definitely happen. At about 3 in the morning, Katie woke up. She heard footsteps walking towards the campsite from a little ways off. They were in the woods somewhere. Her first thought was, okay, it's got to be my father. He's diabetic, and every night he gets up to go to the bathroom maybe 3 or 4 times. He was probably just walking to the bathhouse, and now he's walking back. But then she realized something. The bathhouse was over in one direction, but the footsteps were coming from the complete opposite direction. What was he doing walking towards the campsite from that side of the woods? The footsteps came out of the tree line. They crunched on the dirt as they came into the clearing that was their campsite. And then they stopped about 2 or 3 meters outside of Katie's tent. Now, there were no windows on Katie's little backpacking tent. There were just small vents at the front and the back that kind of pointed down so she couldn't see out. And there was no moon that night, so there was no illumination. You couldn't even pick up a silhouette. It was just total darkness out there. She couldn't see who was there, she could only hear them. But she was still thinking, okay, maybe my dad got lost coming back from the bathhouse because he didn't have a flashlight and he walked too far. That's possible. Or, he could have decided to relieve himself just in the tree line, even though he's not known to do that. He's a guy that always goes to the bathhouse. So she's running through all these scenarios in her head that are convincing her that, oh, that's just my dad. But what she really wanted to hear, what would confirm it for her, was that person walking away from her tent and getting into her father's tent. That would prove it was him. So she's sitting there in the dark, waiting for that confirmation. And then she hears the footsteps again. But instead of walking around her tent towards her father's tent, this person walked right up against her tent very quickly. And they clearly began leaning over her little tiny tent because she could hear them breathing right above her. And this is the moment when she realized with a jolt of ice-cold fear, that's not my dad. And as she's having this terrible revelation that some stranger is outside her tent right now, she has an even worse one. It was a warm night that night. So she was sleeping with her tent unzipped and her legs poking out the end. She mustered all her courage and began to slowly, carefully retract her legs back inside her tent. But before she was able to get them all the way in, this person stood up, turned, and started walking towards the base of her tent right where her legs were. She was completely frozen, terrified about what was about to happen. But this person didn't stop at her feet. They kept moving and, in fact, started circling her tent. But because they were making a lot of noise walking around her, it allowed her to pull her legs back into her tent without them hearing her. So she had this small illusion of safety being fully inside her tent. But her tent was still unzipped at the bottom. She was waiting for this person to come around, crouch down, and look inside, because it was open. And so she's just looking down at the opening, hoping that doesn't happen. But unfortunately, right at this moment, the person walked to the base of her tent and came to a stop, right outside where the opening was. And so she's sitting there, thinking, please don't come in here, please don't come in here, please don't come in here. And even though her feet were pulled up inside her tent now, she suddenly felt something pinch her foot. And she knew it was a hand. Something had reached in and grabbed her foot. She stifled a scream, clamping her hand over her mouth. She started shaking uncontrollably because her instincts were screaming at her, "Don't let this person know you're awake." And luckily, as she was sitting there, shaking from fear and trying to be as quiet as she possibly could, this person stood back up again. They went back to the spot next to her tent and leaned over it once again. And she could hear them breathing right over her. And so for several minutes, she lay there, shaking, with this random person who had just pinched her foot hovering over her tent in the middle of the night. And she had nothing she could do. She just stayed quiet, hoping it was going to end soon. Eventually, this person would turn around and walk over to their cooler and their picnic table and some other things that were out. She heard some rummaging going on. Some things were being moved around. And then this person just kind of walked off into the distance. But she didn't know if they were really gone. She didn't know if they were standing at the edge of the tree line, just waiting for her to come outside. Maybe they had laid a trap for her. And so she just lay there, silent, not moving a muscle. And she's praying to herself, "Please don't let anything happen to me or my father." And all night, she's just laying there. Eventually, probably hours later, she did fall asleep from sheer exhaustion. She woke up again when she heard her father unzipping his tent in the morning. She charged out to meet him, and she could tell right away that he was scared too. And before she could even say anything or begin to describe what happened to her, he said, "Were you outside your tent last night?" At about 2 or 3 in the morning, because I heard all sorts of commotion near our cooler. I wasn't sure if it was an animal or if it was you. And she starts telling him, "No, this is what happened to me." And as she's describing what happened to her, he looks behind her at the picnic table, which was next to their cooler. They had their backpacks on it. Basically anything that didn't fit in their tents, they kept near this picnic table. He points at it, and she turns around. And any item that was in the cooler or in their backpacks or that was just out on the table has been stacked in a perfect pyramid formation on the table. Clearly, the person who was there last night did this. For some reason, they couldn't understand. And as they went over to look at it to see if anything had been taken, they noticed a clear track of footprints in the dirt. Heavy footprints that had been going around and around Katie's tent. So she clearly wasn't imagining it. And in that instant, they packed everything up, threw it in their car, and they left. To this day, they can barely talk about it with each other. It's all the things that could have happened. The father felt horribly guilty because he clearly heard this person but didn't leave his tent, and his daughter was clearly in danger. And his daughter keeps thinking the tent was open. This person was crouched down, reaching into my tent, grabbing my feet. It's such a horrifying image. And so this has been completely traumatizing for them, and they just don't talk about it anymore. From the 1950s until the present, a Canadian family has owned this very isolated cabin in the middle of the Ontario backcountry. It was the only property on this very small lake. There were 2 other cabins across the lake, but they were pretty far away. And with the exception of the side of the cabin that was facing the water, the rest of it was surrounded by really dense forest that went on for miles and miles. About 2 miles away from this cabin, on the other side of a dirt road, was this huge wildlife reserve. It was pretty much just a massive, protected forest. And anytime the family was visiting this cabin, the kids would at some point go into the reserve and go exploring. In 2001, when the family was at the cabin, the kids were across the road over at the reserve. And they decided to walk down this particular trail that they hadn't seen before. They just started walking, and for about 30 minutes, they were seeing new areas they hadn't seen before. And then they came to a clearing. And in the clearing were all these abandoned houses. At first, there was a little debate about whether these were actually abandoned, because they did look like they were in pretty good condition. But when they walked a little bit closer, it became very clear that nature was reclaiming this land. The grass was up to their waists. There were vines growing up the side of the houses. There were cars still parked in driveways that were totally rusted out, with grass growing all through them. And so they knew these were definitely abandoned. They walked up to the first house they saw, and they looked in a window. And they couldn't believe what they were looking at. It was like whoever lived here had left without taking anything. The house was still totally furnished, In fact, their dining room table still had plates and cups and forks and knives on it, like they had just finished dinner and then just got up and left. They started talking about going into these houses and looking around inside, but they started wondering, is this a museum? Is that why everything is in such good repair? Should we not go inside these houses? And they started looking around for any indication that this was not a museum, that these were just plain abandoned. And across the street from the house they were at was this totally decrepit-looking house. They decided to go over there and look in that one. So they looked in a window, and very clearly the ceiling was totally sagging down, and the first floor was buckling completely. And there were clothes and shoes scattered everywhere. And so for them, this was confirmation. This is no museum. These are abandoned. We can totally go look around inside. And so for the next couple of hours, the kids explored all the houses that looked structurally sound, that weren't going to collapse on them. And it was just fascinating. There was all this stuff that was left behind that was fairly valuable, and they didn't take anything. They just thought it was very cool. And after a while, they decided they had seen enough, and they turned around and headed back to their cabin. After they got back, they told their parents about what they'd found. And their father was like, "Man, that sounds awesome. I want to go check that out." And so that day, they went right back over to the abandoned houses. The first house they showed him was the really decrepit-looking one, where the ceiling was sagging and there were women's shoes and clothes all over the ground, to show him for sure these are abandoned, because we had some doubts at first too. These were definitely abandoned. So they looked at that house, and then they went back to the very first house they saw when they walked into this complex, the one that was in great condition and had the dining table still set. So they went inside, and they went upstairs. And they found this bedroom that, like everything else in the house, was totally intact. You had pictures on the wall, it was fully furnished, there were even still sheets made on the bed, and the pillow had a head imprint from whoever was there last. And at the foot of the bed was this beautiful fur coat. The father walked over to it, and he looked at it. And he's like, "This is real fur. This is a really expensive coat. I want to take this for our family." But before he took it, he had a hesitation. Is this really abandoned? You know, if someone had been here, they would have seen footprints all over the house because there was a layer of grime all over the ground. And they could clearly see their own footprints from where they had just come in. And he's like, "No, this is just a weird situation. It's definitely abandoned. Finders keepers." And so he picked up the jacket and he said, "I'm going to give this to Mom after I clean it up." With the jacket in hand, the father and the kids explored the rest of the house. And when they went outside, they realized it was starting to get late and it was probably time to head back. And so they turned around and they started walking away from these houses towards their cabin. They got about 50 or 60 meters away when one of the kids said he just had this weird sense that they were being watched. And so he turned around, and he was shocked when he saw there was an old woman standing in the bedroom that they had just been in where the fur coat was. She had a loose bun on the top of her head, she had this blue shawl on her shoulders over a cream blouse, and she was glaring at them. When the kid saw this woman, he made an audible gasp, and the rest of the group turned around too and saw this woman in the window. And the feeling was instant guilt. They're like, "Oh my goodness, we just stole from this poor woman who lives in this abandoned house." And so right away, the whole group started walking right back towards the house. They were going to give this jacket back. In fact, the dad was saying, "I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have taken this, I'm sorry." And as they were walking back towards the property, the woman in the window, who hadn't said anything, just turned around and walked back into the main part of the house so they couldn't see her anymore. So as they were walking closer to the house, they were assuming she was going to come downstairs to retrieve this jacket that they've taken from her. And so they got right up to the front door, and the father was yelling to her, "I'm sorry, where do you want me to leave this jacket? I can bring it into you." And they're kind of just waiting for her to come downstairs. And she doesn't. She's nowhere to be found. She's not making any sound. She's not indicating what to do. And so after waiting for a couple of minutes, the kids didn't really know what to do, and they were kind of getting uneasy about the situation. But the father was still very confident that he just wanted to give this back and make amends, make peace with her, say he was sorry. And so he walked inside. He told his kids, "Stay here, I'm going to go give it to her." And he went inside and he disappeared upstairs. And then all of a sudden, from across the street, in that decrepit house with the caved-in ceiling, they heard one of the second-floor windows come slamming down. And at the same time, their dad came charging down the stairs, no jacket with him, and he's saying, "Go, go, go." And the kids were spooked from the window getting slammed, and they started running away until they were about 100 meters away from these houses. And they stopped, and they were panting, and they were out of breath. And the kids asked their dad what happened. And he said to them, "I looked everywhere upstairs, and I could not find that lady. I don't know where she is. Either she's hiding from us or something. But I happened to be looking out at that other house, and something caught my eye. There was movement. And I saw another person in the second floor of that building that's falling apart. And I watched them slam the window. And then as soon as they did, I heard someone yell, 'Get out!' And I ran out after you guys." Now, the kids and the dad were absolutely terrified, and they wanted to leave. But they also wanted one more look at these buildings before they did. And when they had run away, they had stopped behind this big group of trees that obscured their view of the buildings. They were out of sight. And so they began to peek their heads around the tree until they could see the building. And they couldn't believe what they saw. Standing in the window of the fur coat room was not only the old woman, but also a very tall man who was holding her shoulders and was bending down because his head was too high to look while standing. He was crouched down, and he was looking out the window next to her. And they were both glaring towards them. The father and his kids were practically falling over themselves to sprint away and back to their cabin. To this day, that family has no idea who those people were, what they were doing there, how they were able to move around without making any noise, and consistently hide from them and not leave any footprints. It was all very strange and terrifying stuff. And then the government ended up demolishing those houses almost immediately after they were there. And so they'll never get any answers, because everything's gone. What's really disturbing about tonight's stories isn't just the laughter outside the tent, or the hand reaching into the darkness, or the people staring through the windows of an abandoned house. It's the fact that in every single story, someone was watching them long before they realized it. Deep in the woods, there's this strange feeling people talk about sometimes, that sudden instinct telling you that you're not alone. Maybe those instincts exist for a reason. Until next time. See ya. In 2010, an explorer named Jeff, a guy who was really passionate about caving, decided to take a trip to Madagascar. This wasn't just a vacation for him. He had a very specific goal in mind. Years earlier, on a previous trip, he had stumbled across a natural cave shaft, a deep hole in the ground that just seemed to call out to him. He'd made notes about it, logged its location, and had been dreaming about coming back to properly explore it ever since. For a caver like Jeff, an unexplored shaft is like an unsolved mystery, and he was finally ready to go find some answers. So, he flies into Madagascar, goes through all the usual travel motions, and gets himself a rental car. He knew the general area where the cave was, but it was remote, not the kind of place you just plug into a GPS. He needed local knowledge to get close, so he hired a guide, a man from a nearby village, to take him out into the wilderness. After a long and bumpy drive, they finally arrived in the region Jeff recognized from his last trip. He pulled out his old, worn notebook, flipping through the pages until he found his hand-drawn maps and coordinates. He used those notes to pinpoint the exact location, and sure enough, there it was. A dark, narrow opening in the earth, about a meter across, just as he remembered it. He paid the guide for his time and asked him to wait by the car. He tried to reassure the man, telling him he wouldn't be gone for a very long time. The plan was simple: rappel down, check out the bottom, and come straight back up. The guide just sort of nodded, probably thinking this foreigner was a little crazy for wanting to go down a hole in the middle of nowhere. Jeff laid out all his gear. He was meticulous, a professional. He had his ropes, his harness, his helmet with a headlamp, and his backpack. Inside that backpack was his technical ascending gear, the specialized equipment he would need to climb back up the rope. The shaft itself was about 50 meters deep. That's over 160 feet. The first 20 meters or so were on a bit of an angle, a steep slide downwards. But after that, the final 30 meters were a straight, vertical drop into blackness. From what Jeff could tell, there was a small chamber at the bottom, just big enough to stand up and walk around in, but there were no other tunnels leading off from it. This was a simple in-and-out job. Go down, touch the bottom, come back up. One of the challenges of a shaft like this is the visibility. The opening was so narrow that as soon as Jeff started his descent, his own body would block most of the sunlight. A few meters down, he'd be relying completely on his headlamp to see. With his gear checked and his rope secured, he gave the guide a final wave and started his descent. He moved slowly and confidently, the rough rock walls brushing against him as he made his way down the first 20 meters of the angled slope. Everything was going perfectly. He reached the 20-meter mark, the point where the shaft transitioned from an angle to a straight vertical drop. He paused for a moment, adjusting his position on the rope, getting ready for the final 30-meter descent into the darkness below. And that's when he saw something. Just a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye right at the edge of his headlamp's beam. He instinctively turned his head, focusing the light on the wall of the shaft to get a better look. What he saw made his blood run cold. The wall was moving. It was covered in thousands of tiny, black, shiny bodies scattering away from the light. They were black widow spiders. Thousands upon thousands of them. He swung his light around, and his heart hammered in his chest. The entire vertical section of the shaft, from where he was hanging all the way down to the bottom, was a living, moving carpet of black widows. He was frozen in place, suspended on a rope 30 meters above the bottom of the cave, completely surrounded by one of the most venomous spiders in the world. His first instinct, his only instinct, was to get out. He wanted to stop right there, turn around, and climb back up to the surface as fast as he possibly could. But he couldn't. And that was the real problem. To go back up the rope he was currently on, he needed his ascending gear. And his ascending gear was packed away neatly and safely inside his backpack, which was strapped to his back. Trying to swing around, take his pack off, fish out the gear, and set it up while dangling in the middle of a spider-infested shaft would be incredibly dangerous. It was a recipe for a fatal fall. So he was trapped. He had only one option, and it was the last thing in the world he wanted to do. He had to continue his descent. He had to go down the final 30 meters right through the heart of the spider nest to reach the bottom of the cave. Only then could he safely take his pack off, get his gear out, and begin the climb back up. He took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He looked down into the darkness, knowing what was waiting for him. And then he began his slow, awful descent. With every meter he lowered himself, the reality of his situation became more intense. Periodically, his body would bump against the wall, and he'd hear the sickening rustle of thousands of spiders scattering around him. He could feel them. He saw them climbing onto the sleeves of his shirt, and he'd have to brush them off, trying not to panic. He saw them on the rope itself right above his hands, and he'd frantically try to knock them away before he had to grab that section of rope. It was a living nightmare. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his feet touched the solid ground at the bottom of the shaft. He was standing in the small chamber, but he was far from safe. He could hear the spiders all around him, a constant, quiet crawling sound on the walls. He quickly shrugged off his backpack and shone his light on it. It was covered in spiders. He carefully unzipped it, and more spiders crawled out from inside. He had to reach in, carefully pushing past the spiders, to pull out his ascending gear. Once he had it, he didn't waste a second. He threw his pack back on, attached the gear to the rope, and began making his way back up. The whole time, he was in a constant battle, brushing spiders off his clothes, his gear, his body. It was a slow and terrifying climb, but the growing circle of light from the entrance above him gave him strength. Finally, he pulled himself over the edge and collapsed onto the ground, back in the sunlight, back in the fresh air. The first thing he did, without even thinking, was strip off all his clothing. He had to get any remaining spiders off of him. He shook out his shirt, his pants, everything. He took his bag, turned it upside down, and dumped everything out. More spiders fell to the ground. You can only imagine what the guide was thinking, just sitting by the car, watching this foreigner emerge from a hole in the ground and immediately start taking all his clothes off. But Jeff didn't care. After he was sure he was spider-free, he got dressed again. He walked over to the car, and the guide just looked at him, not saying a word. Miraculously, Jeff hadn't been bitten a single time. As they started the long drive back towards the city, Jeff took out his notebook. He found the page for this particular cave. The name he had originally given it from his first visit was the Crooked Tube. He took his pen and scratched that name out with a thick, angry line. And above it, in big, clear letters, he wrote a new name, The Entrance to Hell. Back in 2006, a 14-year-old boy named Evan lived on a farm in North Carolina. But this wasn't your typical farm with cows and cornfields. It was a pine tree farm. His family's business was harvesting and baling pine straw, which is a big commodity in the landscaping world. Their house was situated right in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly planted pine trees lined up in neat, endless rows. They were totally isolated. They didn't have any neighbors nearby, and there was only one long, straight road that led onto the property. From the main house, they could look out and see all the way down that road, right through the rows of trees. This meant it was basically impossible for anyone to visit without being spotted long before they arrived. The house itself was built on a very slight hill. To keep it level, one side of the house was effectively built up on stilts. And on that side of the house, on the first floor, was the living room. This created a strange effect. If you were in the living room looking out the window, you were actually looking down at the ground at a steep angle. It felt like you were on the second story, even though you were on the first. And the window in that living room was unique. It was huge, stretching almost the entire length of the room, nearly 50 feet across. At night, that window was kind of creepy, because you could see so clearly down the long, straight rows of trees, you'd often see animals darting between the trunks in the darkness. That alone was enough to give you a weird feeling. But it was the size of the window that really got to people. When you were in that room at night, with the lights on inside and pure blackness outside, you just felt incredibly exposed. Like you were on a stage. Between the creepy animals and the feeling of vulnerability, the family basically avoided using the living room at all after the sun went down. That winter, Evan's cousin came to stay with them for a visit. Since the main house didn't have any extra bedrooms, the only place for the boys to sleep was in the living room. There were 2 couches in there. One was positioned right underneath that giant 50-foot window. The other was on the opposite side of the room, against a solid wall with no window. Evan, being the host, took the couch under the window, and his cousin took the other one. The first night his cousin was there, they tried to make it a little less creepy. They found a big sheet and hung it up over the window, but it wasn't big enough. It only covered about 75% of the glass, leaving the 2 ends of the window, the flanks, totally exposed. Still, it blocked the main view from where their couches were, so it gave them a little sense of privacy. After goofing around for a while, the 2 boys finally fell asleep around midnight. A couple of hours later, they were woken up by the sound of Evan's dogs barking. They were way off in the pine trees, somewhere out in the darkness. Now, Evan was used to his dogs. They were always running around the property, barking at squirrels or raccoons, so the sound of barking itself wasn't a red flag. But this time, the barking didn't stop. It was persistent and had an urgent tone to it. It was so continuous that it eventually made Evan's cousin get up off his couch. He walked across the room to the part of the window that wasn't covered by the sheet, right at the foot of Evan's couch, and peered out into the night. Evan was still lying down. He wasn't about to get up and look out the window himself, so he just watched his cousin's face, trying to get a read on what he was seeing. He noticed his cousin had this really perplexed look. He was squinting his eyes, leaning closer to the glass, like he was trying to make sense of something. So Evan whispered to him, "Hey, what's going on?" "What do you see?" His cousin replied, his voice a little shaky. "I don't know if my mind's playing tricks on me or not, but I'm pretty sure I see people out there." At that, Evan jumped off the couch and ran over to the window, getting right up next to his cousin to see for himself. He scanned the rows of trees. The first thing he noticed was that the moon was very bright that night, and there was a light dusting of snow on the ground which made everything seem to glow. It was actually pretty easy to see. He was looking out, maybe about 100 meters into the woods, when he saw it. Someone's leg extended out from behind one of the pine trees as if they were about to step into the open space between two rows. Evan just stared, his mind racing. He couldn't believe he was seeing a person. Nobody ever came onto their property, especially not in the middle of the night. Then a body followed the leg. A tall, dark figure walked calmly from one row of trees to the next, disappearing behind another tree. Evan grabbed his cousin's arm. "Did you just see that?" His cousin just nodded, his eyes wide. "Yeah, I saw that." They continued to stare in the direction where the person had gone. A couple of minutes passed in total silence. Then they saw another leg emerge, going the other way, back towards where the first person had come from. The legs stepped out into the gap, and another tall figure walked across. Except this time, instead of going straight across, it looked like they were moving at a slight angle, an angle that was bringing them closer to the house. The boys looked at each other, not knowing what to do. They were terrified. So they just kept looking out the window in stunned silence. And as they were looking, they saw the person emerge again. Except now, they weren't 100 meters away anymore. They were maybe 20 meters away. They had closed the distance impossibly fast, and the boys hadn't seen them move. This time, when the leg came out from behind the pine tree, the figure didn't walk across the gap. It stopped, right in the middle, in the open. And then it turned its head and looked directly at the boys in the window. And then it began to run straight toward them. The boys practically fell over each other trying to get away from the window. Evan started yelling for his father, who was asleep upstairs. Instinctively, the two boys just started running around the house, locking every single door, shutting every single window. As they went from door to door, the anxiety was building and building. They were thinking, if I don't get this lock turned fast enough, that person who was running at us is going to come barging right through. At every door, their fear was through the roof. They managed to get everything shut and locked just as Evan's father came charging down the stairs. He had his gun in his hand and he was yelling, "What's going on?" They quickly told him that there was someone on the property. Without hesitating, their dad charged out the front door. The front door wasn't on the same wall as the big living room window. It was on the side of the house. So once he was outside, he had to turn to the right to look out in the direction the boys had described. He stood on the porch and just started yelling into the darkness, screaming at whoever was out there that if they came any closer, he was going to shoot them. He screamed for them to get away from his house. And then there was just silence. The boys waited inside, peering around, checking the window. They didn't see anything. After a minute, their dad came back inside, shut the heavy door, and locked it. He looked at Evan and said, "Keep an eye out. If you see him again, you let me know." Looking back on it later, Evan would say that they really should have called 911 right then. But as a kid, he just understood that that wasn't how his family operated. They took care of things themselves. So even with a strange person running at their house, calling the police just wasn't the first thought. His dad was effectively telling him to be a lookout. So Evan and his cousin went back into the living room. They were apprehensive, but they slowly crept up to the window and looked out. After 5 or 10 minutes of seeing nothing, they started to calm down a little. They reasoned with each other that Evan's dad was a pretty intimidating guy. He had just been outside, screaming and yelling with a gun, threatening to shoot them. They figured the person, or people, probably got the message and were long gone. So the boys got back onto their couches. It took them a long time, but eventually they did fall back asleep. The next morning, when the boys woke up, the first thing they wanted to do was go outside. They needed to see if they could find any footprints. Part of them still thought that maybe they had imagined the whole thing, that their minds were playing tricks on them in the dark. So they went out the front door and walked around the side of the house down into the trees where they had seen the figures. And they found them. Footprints in the light snow. It was a confirmation. Okay, someone was definitely out here. It wasn't them. These weren't their footprints. They started following the tracks back towards the house. And that's when they realized something even more disturbing. At a certain point, they could see that there weren't just one set of footprints. There were two distinct sets. There had been two people out there in the dark. And it got even worse. They followed the two sets of footprints all the way up to the house. And they found two different circles of trampled snow, where the people had been standing for a long time. The footprints stopped right underneath the living room window, one circle on each side, in the exact spots along the flanks of the window where the sheet had not been covering the glass. The horrible realization washed over them. Over the course of the night, when Evan and his cousin were standing at that window, looking out into the trees, there was a very good chance that one or two strangers were tucked up right against the side of the house in their blind spot. Because of that steep downward angle from the living room window, anyone pressed up against the wall would have been completely invisible. And then, for sure, after Evan and his cousin got back into their beds and were sleeping, there were two strangers standing right there, just feet away, probably pulling themselves up to look inside. When Evan's father saw the footprints, he immediately grabbed his gun again and tried to follow them back into the woods to see where they came from. But the snow cover was patchy, and at some point the tracks just disappeared. They never figured out who those two people were. Evan would later say that after that night, his cousin refused to ever come over for a sleepover again. In October of 2005, a 21-year-old named Nathan was back home in Elk Grove, California. He was visiting his mother at her apartment for a couple of days. Her place was in a really safe complex. It was gated, there were lights everywhere, cameras, the whole deal. It was the kind of place where if you heard something go bump in the night, you just assumed it was a noisy neighbor or a cat knocking something over. It wasn't a place you worried about. On the last night of his stay, Nathan was lying in bed in the guest room. He was listening to the familiar, comforting sounds of the night, the low hum of the street lamp just outside his window, the chirping of crickets, and the distant sound of cars passing by on the main road. He drifted off to sleep to that gentle soundtrack. At about 2 a.m, Nathan woke up. Or at least, he thought he woke up. He found that he couldn't move his body at all. He could move his eyes, darting them around the room, but the rest of him was completely paralyzed. He had never experienced sleep paralysis before, but instinctively, he understood that this must be what it was. He also noticed that the room was completely silent. The hum of the street lamp was gone. The crickets were quiet. There was no more traffic noise. Just total unnerving silence. He started flashing his eyes around the room, trying to take stock of his surroundings since he couldn't move his head. The bed he was in was positioned in the back right corner, as far away from the door as possible. From where he was lying, if he looked to his right, in the corner there was a big, heavy armoire. As he scanned his eyes to the left from the armoire, he came to the bedroom door, which was on the opposite side of the room from his bed. If he kept scanning left, his eyes would reach the foot of his bed. And just beyond the foot of his bed, he knew there was a small table and a chair. But because he was lying flat on his back, he couldn't actually see that part of the room. With all the strength he could muster, he managed to raise his head just a few inches off the pillow, just enough so he could get a line of sight to that one section of the room he hadn't been able to see yet. He saw the table and the chair. And he saw, standing in the corner next to them, a dark figure. It was just standing there, looking at him. He was completely frozen with fear. His first thought was that there was an intruder in the house. How did they get in? What were they doing in his room? He managed to keep his head up just long enough to get a decent look at this dark figure. He determined it was most likely a woman, and she had a shawl or a veil covering her face. And then, just before his head fell back to the pillow, he saw her suddenly crouch down on the ground out of his view. Nathan's head fell back, and now he was just lying there, paralyzed, knowing there was a stranger in his room. He couldn't lift his head anymore. He was staring at the ceiling, looking around with his eyes, seeing the armoire, seeing the door, but unable to see the corner where she was. And then he heard a sound. It was the sound of someone slithering along the ground just out of his sight. He could hear her breathing. And she was getting closer and closer to the edge of his bed. He was lying there, absolutely terrified, so scared he couldn't even make a sound. He kept telling himself, this has to be a dream. Wake up, wake up, wake up. And then, this woman, she stood up, she leaned out over his bed and looked down at him. Her face was pale, almost white, and her eyes were dark and sunk way back in her head. Then she began to slowly crawl on top of him. Nathan was just staring up at her. He wanted to close his eyes, to look away, but he couldn't. He just felt his chest being pressed down, the weight of her on him. He could hear the sounds of the mattress springs compressing all around him as this woman positioned herself on his chest. And then finally, he managed to let out a scream. And just like that, he was awake. The woman was gone. He shot up in bed, looking around frantically. There was nobody in his room. The familiar hum of the street lamp and the sound of the crickets and the traffic outside all returned at once. His mom came running into the room. "Hey, are you okay? I heard screaming in here." He was still catching his breath. "Oh, no. I had a bad dream. I'm fine now. I had a terrible dream, but I'm fine now." His mom looked at him, concerned. "Okay, all right. You need anything?" He shook his head. "Nope." So she came over, gave him a hug and a kiss, and went back to her own bed. Nathan, however, couldn't go back to sleep. He went downstairs, flipped on the TV, and put on a Disney movie, Aladdin. He fell asleep on the couch with the movie and all the lights on. He didn't have any more sleep paralysis that night. The next day, Nathan got up and headed back to his own house. But he couldn't shake the experience. It was so much more terrifying than he ever would have imagined. He just kept thinking to himself, I can't believe there are people who put up with this on a regular basis. But, after a couple of days of being home and not experiencing it again, time went on and he just kind of pushed it to the back of his mind. A few months later, in March of 2006, Nathan was at a big family party in Chico, California. It was a big outdoor barbecue. All of his family was there. At some point, his sister showed up. This was a great surprise. She wasn't supposed to be able to make it, and he hadn't seen her in a while. He immediately pulled her aside so they could catch up. They spent the first hour just chatting about their lives, what they were up to. Towards the end of their conversation, Nathan suddenly felt compelled to tell her about his sleep paralysis experience. The reason he wanted to tell her, specifically, was because he knew that she knew he was a total skeptic. If he told her this is what happened, she would believe that's what he genuinely saw, and she wouldn't think he was making it up or exaggerating. So he started by saying, I had the weirdest experience at Mom's apartment a couple of months ago. I'm pretty sure it was sleep paralysis. His sister immediately cut him off. Her eyes went wide. Wait a minute, she said. I had sleep paralysis for the first time in my life 2 weeks ago at Mom's apartment. It was horrible. I was in the guest room, and then I saw this woman, and she was standing on me. I thought I was going to die. It was horrible. Nathan just stared at her. That's exactly what happened to me. I was lying in the guest room and I couldn't move, and then I saw a woman in the corner and she stood on my chest. They proceeded to go over all the details of each of their stories, and they discovered that they had had almost the exact same experience. The silent room, the figure in the corner, the feeling of being crushed. At the end of it, they just sat there trying to find a rational explanation for how they both could have had their one and only sleep paralysis experience in the same room around the same time and see the exact same thing. It was just too much of a coincidence. But ultimately, neither of them was really prepared to start discussing what else it could be, some paranormal explanation. So they decided to just kind of laugh it off nervously and say, man, that's pretty weird. And they moved on. After the party was over, Nathan went back to his house and told his wife about the crazy coincidence he and his sister had discovered. His wife agreed that it was wild, but after that, Nathan just did not want to think about it or talk about it anymore. He pushed it out of his mind and moved on with his life. 5 months later, in August of 2006, Nathan's mom moved out of that apartment building and into a 2-story house still in Elk Grove. Shortly after she moved in, she asked Nathan if he would come and spend a couple of nights with her, just to help her settle in. And Nathan said, sure. In order to understand what happens next, you need a basic layout of her new house. When you walk in through the double front doors, to your left is a formal living room. In the center of the house, a hallway shoots straight back to the kitchen. And to your right when you walk in, there's a wall, and on that wall are the stairs leading up to the second floor. If you take those stairs up, you reach a landing where there's a window that looks out into the backyard. Immediately to your right, on that landing, there is a single door. That's the master bedroom where Nathan's mom would sleep. From the landing, if you turn to your left, there would be another door, a mirror image of the master bedroom door. This door was the guest room, and that's where Nathan was going to stay. If you went inside that guest room, the bed was located in the back right corner, the same layout as the guest room in the old apartment building. For someone lying in the bed, their feet would be closest to the door. From Nathan's perspective, in the bed, the only other piece of furniture in this new guest room was a table against the right-hand wall, and on that table was a TV. The first night Nathan stayed at the new house was totally uneventful. The second night, not so much. He was up in the guest room, lying on the bed, watching TV. The lights in the room were off, so it was just the glow from the television. At some point, he dozed off. He woke up a short time later, and he couldn't move. It was the same sensation he had felt before back at his mom's apartment. He began to panic. The last time he felt this way, a strange, veiled woman stood on his chest and made him feel like he was dying. So immediately, he was trying to move his body, but he couldn't. Using just his eyes, he started looking around the room, praying that this woman was not in there with him. He looked to the right, to the corner. He could see it clearly. There was no one there. From that corner, he scanned his eyes across the room. He saw the TV. It was still on. He kept scanning, and he saw the door. It was open. And then he scanned further and was just barely able to make out the space at the foot of his bed all the way to the corner. The woman, she wasn't in the room. Initially, he felt this incredible wave of relief. She's not here. But then he found himself focusing on the open door, which led out into the dark hallway. And he was thinking to himself, please, please, do not come walking through that door. So he just stared at the open doorway, hoping he would break out of the sleep paralysis. That's when he noticed something about the TV. It was flickering. He averted his gaze from the door to the TV screen. And he realized that what he was looking at on the TV did not look familiar. It didn't look like a TV show. It looked like CCTV camera footage. Like security camera footage. And then he realized the footage he was looking at was of the inside of his mother's kitchen downstairs. He recognized the layout, the cabinets. That was his mother's house. He was staring at the footage thinking, why is this playing on my TV? I don't think there's even a camera down there. And as he's thinking this, he sees on the camera the woman with the veil walks into the middle of the frame. She stops, and she looks up directly at the camera. Right as she does, the TV turns off. The room was now completely dark. There was no more ambient light. The hallway was dark. And he was left there, paralyzed in bed, knowing that this woman was downstairs in the kitchen. As he's lying there in the terrifying silence, he hears her start to run through the house. It sounded like an animal, barreling into things as she ran through the bottom floor. He heard her crash around, and then the sound stopped right at the foot of the stairs. And he's thinking to himself, I know where she's going. She's coming up to my room. As he's lying there, he can feel his heart racing, and he's staring at that open black doorway. He knows she's going to come flying up those stairs and through that door. But instead of running up the stairs, he hears her take one slow step. Then a second slow step. And as she's making her way up the stairs, one step at a time, he's just thinking, please break out of this. Stop this paralysis. Wake up. Wake up. And then he sees her head emerge above the floor line. She turns to look at him from the stairs into the room. And once she sees it's him, she bolts around the corner and starts charging into his room on all fours like an animal. At this point, Nathan lets out a primal scream. He is absolutely scared for his life as this woman charges towards him. She stops dead in her tracks, right in the middle of the room. She looks at him, turns around, and crashes out of the room, charges back downstairs, and then it's silent. As soon as she was gone, Nathan could sit up. Except it did not feel like the first time he had sleep paralysis at his mom's old apartment. Back then, when he sat up, he had a sensation of relief, like you've woken up, you were asleep before, but now you're awake. This time, it was like he was always awake, but now he could just suddenly move. He did not have a sense of relief. In fact, he was worried she was still in the house. And as he's sitting up in bed, his mother comes running into the room. She looks disheveled, she's half asleep. And she says, Was that you? Were you running around the house? I could have sworn I heard someone running around the house. Was that you? Nathan's looking at her, and he can't even process what he's just been through. He didn't know if it was real or if it was a dream. He was trying to find the words to describe what had just happened, but he couldn't. He just looked at his mom and said, Mom, we have to check the house. We have to make sure no one's in the house. So the two of them flipped on every light upstairs. They weren't even talking at this point. It was just survival mode. They turned on all the lights, and Nathan led the way down the stairs. They went through the whole house, flicking on every light, and they managed to search the whole place. There was no sign of a break-in. There was no one in their house. After the coast was clear and they felt like they were not in immediate danger, they went into the kitchen to talk about what had just happened. Nathan just laid it all out. He said, Okay, Mom, I just got to tell you everything that I'm thinking right now. I can't really process what just happened. I think it was a bad dream, but I'm starting to think that it could be something else, or I'm just losing my mind. A few months ago, I was sleeping in your guest room in your old apartment, and I had an experience that I'm almost positive was sleep paralysis. You know, I was lying there, I couldn't move, and this figure was in the room, and they were standing on me. It was terrifying. But then, a couple of months after that, I talked to my sister, and I told her about it. And she told me that very recently, right before you moved into this house, actually, she was in that same room, and she also had basically the exact same experience. She had never had sleep paralysis before. I had never had sleep paralysis before. So we both had the exact same horrifying experience, in the same room, around the same time. And then just now, tonight, I had another sleep paralysis experience with the same woman who was running around the house. And you just said you heard her running around the house. His mom looked really concerned, but she wasn't shocked. She said to Nathan, I have seen this woman. I saw her in my apartment a long time ago. But I remember what you're describing. That's the experience I had. This woman, she showed up in the room and she stood on me and it scared the heck out of me. But I didn't tell anyone because I just thought it was sleep paralysis. Nathan and his mom proceeded to spend the next several hours just talking through what this could be. How could all three of them, him, his mom, and his sister, how could all of them have had the exact same, very specific, terrifying experience? And how could tonight, when Nathan had this experience, how could his mom have heard those footsteps if that was indeed just sleep paralysis? Because it wasn't Nathan running around, he was paralyzed in his bedroom. And it wasn't his mom, she was in her own bedroom. And she didn't have any pets. So who, or what, could it have been? Nathan says that he and his family are still totally rattled by this experience, and they still don't have an answer. And this is a family of skeptics, so they're not looking for a reason to call this paranormal. They simply don't have the answers. Nathan has said that he, his mom, and his sister have not had any further experiences with the woman in black ever since that last terrifying experience Nathan had at her new house. And they're just hoping it stays that way. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On paper, Austin Harrouff had the kind of childhood most people would envy. He was born on the 21st of December, 1996, to a dentist, father, and a pharmacist mother, and grew up in Palm Beach County, Florida, one of the wealthiest areas in the entire country. It was the kind of place filled with luxury homes, sunshine, and opportunity. By 2021, more than 40 billionaires lived in the county, and for most of Austin's early life, everything seemed stable, comfortable, and normal. But in 2010, when Austin was 13 years old, that stability suddenly cracked. His parents announced they were getting a divorce. For Austin and his younger sister, Haley, who was only a year younger than him, the news was a massive shock. And what made it even more overwhelming was how quickly everything changed afterward. Within that same year, both of their parents had already started new relationships. Suddenly, the life Austin had always known felt completely different almost overnight. Now, of course, this was a huge shock to Austin and to his younger sister Haley, who was only a year younger than him. But, by all accounts, they both adjusted to their new normal relatively quickly. A big part of that was because the kids didn't have to move out. They got to stay in the familiar family home with their mom, which provided a sense of stability. Their father did move out, but he made sure to get a home that was very close by, so he was never far away. The family dynamic had changed, but the core pieces were still there. About a year after the divorce, Austin began high school, and he didn't just attend, he absolutely excelled. From day one, he was placed into all advanced classes, and even within these challenging courses filled with the brightest students, Austin was consistently at the top of his class. He was smart, dedicated, and driven. Austin was also a big athletic guy. He stood at about 6 feet tall and weighed a solid 200 pounds. So, naturally, he gravitated towards sports. He played football for all 4 years, he was in high school, a significant commitment. And for 1 year, his sophomore year, he also took up wrestling. But despite his size and his willingness to play these very rough, very physical sports, Austin was not an aggressive person by nature. In fact, his football coaches actually used to criticize him for not being aggressive enough. On game days, they would try to get him worked up, try to make him mad, hoping that it would inspire him to go out on the field and just smash some people. But it never really worked. Because Austin was just Austin. He was a laid-back, easygoing guy who was actually much more interested in helping people than he was in hurting them. Towards the end of his high school years, this desire to help people became a central focus for him. He became almost obsessed with trying to identify a career path that would allow him to help the most people possible. And he was so genuinely passionate about this that whenever he spoke about it, a huge involuntary smile would just appear on his face. It was impossible to miss his enthusiasm. Because of this, and because of Austin's generally happy and positive disposition, his father very lovingly started referring to him as the happy boy. Shortly before Austin's high school graduation in 2015, a letter arrived in the mail that would set the course for his future. It was from Florida State University, and it was a letter of acceptance, informing him that he had been admitted into their prestigious 4-year pre-med program. Austin had settled on medicine as being the ultimate way he could fulfill his dream of helping people. So, being accepted into this very competitive program was like a best-case scenario come to life. The news sent waves of excitement through the family. Austin and his parents, his sister, they were all absolutely elated. That summer that followed his high school graduation was totally charmed. Austin was on cloud 9, living out the final carefree days before heading off to college. He spent a lot of time with his family, soaking up the moments with his parents and his sister. He hung out with his friends, making memories they would all look back on. Then, finally, at the end of the summer, the day came. His family packed all of his belongings into the car, and they all drove 6 hours north to Tallahassee, where the Florida State campus was located. They helped him move into his new dorm room, setting up his new life. And afterwards, they gave him a big hug, wished him good luck, and they left. I'm sure on that long ride back home, his family members thought to themselves that Austin was doing so great. He wasn't just ready for college, he was ready to be an adult. He was ready to live on his own, to be responsible, to chase his dreams. And at the end of Austin's first year in college, that belief seemed to be entirely accurate. On the surface, he was thriving. Austin got excellent grades in his demanding pre-med courses. He met a nice girlfriend. And even though he wasn't playing organized sports like football anymore, he had found another athletic outlet in bodybuilding. He became passionate about fitness and even built a decent-sized social media presence around his bodybuilding journey. From the outside, he was the picture of success. But underneath all of this public success that Austin was having that year, he was actually struggling. A lot of the time, he just wasn't telling anyone. He kept a journal, and in its private pages, he documented a deep and persistent sense of inadequacy. This feeling was caused primarily by his perception that his peers didn't accept him, that he didn't fit in. And so he would write endlessly about how if he could just stop being so shy, if he could just be more assertive and more outgoing, then more people would embrace him. They would like him. They would finally accept him. Over the course of that year, Austin also started to self-medicate, abusing different substances to cope with his inner turmoil. These included things like alcohol and marijuana, but also Vyvanse. Vyvanse is a powerful stimulant drug typically used to treat people with attention deficit disorder, and he was using it without a prescription. He also began experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs like acid and mushrooms, and he tried MDMA, which is a kind of cross between a stimulant and a hallucinogen, and those are just the drugs that we are aware he was taking. It's entirely possible, even likely, that he was taking other drugs too. So, Austin began to oscillate between these two extremes. He would be on the high of whatever drug or combination of drugs he was on, and then he would crash down to the low of his sober mind, which was a mind totally saturated with anxious and depressive thoughts. Before the end of that first school year, Austin was secretly poised for a full-blown mental breakdown. And it seemed like on some level he knew it was coming too. In the last month before the end of school, his internet search history paints a terrifying picture of his state of mind. It was filled with desperate questions. Questions like, I think I'm crazy, what do I do, and how do you know if you're crazy? He searched for how to deal with obsessive thoughts. And then there were searches that suggested a complete disconnect from reality. Do I need to sleep? And what happens if you don't sleep? It was clear from these searches that he was starting to seriously question his own sanity. He was lost and scared. When Austin finally returned back home from Florida State for the summer, his family immediately noticed there was something deeply wrong with him. This was not the same happy boy who had left for college less than a year ago. Within just a few days of being home, Austin had moved his bed from his comfortable bedroom down into the family garage. When his family asked him why, he gave them a chilling explanation. He said the house was full of demons. At night, instead of sleeping, Austin would patrol the house. He would literally just walk all around the house all night long, never stopping. And every 2 hours, like clockwork, he would knock on the bedroom doors of his family members. He would knock and then loudly announce that he was guarding them from the demons in the house. Now, you can imagine how his family felt at the time. This behavior was so unbelievably weird, so totally out of character for the Austin they knew, that they just didn't really know what to do. Even though it was obvious that something was terribly wrong, they didn't immediately jump into action. At first, the only thing they did was to just start locking their bedroom doors at night to prevent Austin from coming inside during his strange nighttime patrols. But as the summer progressed, Austin's behavior didn't get any better. He continued to act totally bizarre, totally weird, with no rational explanation. His family became more and more convinced that he must be on drugs. To them, that was the only thing that could possibly explain this complete and total personality shift. So, when they confronted him about his drug use, he would admit it. He told them he was taking drugs, lots of different drugs, psychedelics, stimulants, you name it. And so naturally, his family latched onto his drug use as being the root cause of all his strange behavior. They focused their efforts almost exclusively on that one issue, on trying to get Austin clean again, believing that if they could just stop the drugs, their old son, the happy boy, would return. But towards the end of the summer, something shifted. Austin insisted that he wasn't taking any drugs anymore. But even with that claim, he was still acting totally crazy, totally unhinged. So, around mid-August, the family decided they had to do something more drastic. They decided they had to utilize something in Florida called the Baker Act. Under the Baker Act, individuals who are suspected of having a severe mental illness can be detained for up to 72 hours at the request of their loved one. And during these 72 hours, this individual is thoroughly assessed by medical professionals to see what's going on with them. Then, at the end of those 72 hours, they're given a treatment plan that their family is supposed to help them enact. It was a serious step, but they felt they had no other choice. But before the family could put this plan into motion, something horrific happened. On the morning of August 15th, one of Austin's very close friends, someone he had known since the second grade, got an unexpected visit. Austin just showed up at his house without calling ahead or letting him know, which was very uncharacteristic. The friend opened the door, and Austin just stood there and asked him a single bizarre question. "What year was I born?" The friend, confused, answered, 1996. As soon as Austin heard the answer, he didn't give any reaction to it. He just turned around, walked away, and left. So, this longtime friend is standing in his doorway, watching Austin walk away, wondering what on earth is going on with this guy. Is he high on drugs? Is he drunk? What was that all about? The friend goes back inside his house, and he's thinking to himself, what should I do? After a couple of minutes, he decides he has to call Austin just to make sure he's okay. So he calls him, and Austin picks up. It's unclear exactly what they talked about on the phone, but the friend managed to convince Austin to come back to his house and just spend the day with him. In reality, the friend just wanted to keep an eye on him to make sure Austin was okay. So Austin comes back to the friend's house. Then the two of them would actually leave the house and meet up with some of their other friends who were also in town for the summer. They also met up with Austin's sister, Haley. The group decided they were going to go to the beach for the day. But on their walk to the beach, Austin tells the group that he just needs to get something from his house and that he'll meet them down at the water. At this point, the group believes Austin is more or less fine, maybe just a little off. So they say, "Okay, yep, we'll meet you down there." So Austin breaks off from the group and goes to his house. When he comes back to the beach and meets up with his friends again, he has completely changed his outfit. He was now wearing this very thick, large football jersey. He was wearing long sweatpants that were also very thick. He had on 2 wristwatches, one on each wrist. And he had on sunglasses. As he walks down onto the beach, his friends look up at him. It's super hot out, and they're at the beach in Florida in August. This is a totally weird and inappropriate outfit to have on, and immediately they start kind of giving him a hard time about it, teasing him about his strange outfit choice. But Austin did not think it was funny at all. At first, he was just quiet. But then he kind of lashed out at them and said, "If you tell me I'm crazy, I will kill you." At this, his friends immediately stopped teasing him. Everyone just said, "Okay, man. Hey, didn't mean anything by it. Just giving you a hard time. No big deal." But Austin was clearly worked up, very agitated. So his sister comes over to him and she's trying to calm him down, telling him, hey, calm down. It's okay. It's not a big deal. And during this conversation, Austin suddenly seems to go back to being somewhat normal again. He turns to his sister and he says, completely seriously, I'm actually half horse and I'm immortal. His sister is just stunned. She looks at him and says, what? You really need to get professional help. You need to see a therapist or a psychologist or something. Something is wrong with you, and it's been wrong all summer. You need to get help. Now, apparently, Austin actually responded to this very positively. He looked at her and said, I agree. There is something going on, and I do need to get help. You're right. So after that strange exchange, Austin and the rest of the group, they stayed at the beach for several more hours. Then, in the evening time, Austin, his sister, and that same very close friend, the guy who saw Austin in the morning, when he asked what year he was born, they all said they had to leave. The trio leaves the beach and they head to Duffy's, which was a local restaurant in town. They were going there to meet up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend for dinner. So, as they're getting to this restaurant, they're walking along the sidewalk, getting closer and closer, when suddenly Austin turns to his sister and says, hey, I need to test out my immortality. And then he just turns away from her, away from the sidewalk, and starts walking directly into traffic. He was just going to let a car hit him to test if he was truly immortal. His sister, with incredible reflexes, immediately was able to grab him. She pulled him back onto the sidewalk and then basically stood on his left side, physically preventing him from running out into the traffic again. She kind of pushed him along up the sidewalk right up to the front door of the restaurant. And when they got there, Austin had stopped trying to walk into traffic. He was acting normal again. It was there at the entrance that the trio met up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend. The five of them then went inside Duffy's restaurant. It was about 7:45 p.m. when they got inside. They were very quickly sat at a table in the very back of the restaurant in a booth, and there happened to be a CCTV camera that was watching them while they were inside the building. So they're all sitting at this booth, and about 3 minutes after having sat down, Austin gets up. He walks away from the booth and walks as if he's going towards the bathroom. But then he stops. He doesn't go to the bathroom. He turns around and walks back towards the front of the building, and then he walks right out the front doors. He just leaves the restaurant altogether. Now, it's unclear if the rest of his family at the table saw him do this. It doesn't seem like they did. But just a minute later, Austin comes back inside the restaurant and just walks right back to his table and sits down like absolutely nothing had ever happened. Less than 10 minutes later, Austin would get up again from his table. Except this time, instead of pretending to go to the bathroom, he just walks straight from his table right out the front doors of the restaurant and disappears. A couple of minutes later, Austin's mother, who was not at dinner with them, she was at her home, which happened to be nearby this restaurant. She was home when she heard the sound of someone coming into her house. So she went around to see who it was, and she found her son, Austin, in her kitchen. He was drinking vegetable oil straight from the bottle. And there was Parmesan cheese all over the counter that apparently he had been eating as well. So she runs up to him and she grabs the bottle of vegetable oil and puts it down. She tells him to stop. At which point, Austin does stop. Then, I guess Austin just went up to his room and he changed out of his clothes, perhaps because he got oil all over his shirt. And then his mom just drove him back to the restaurant. She watched him get out of the car and she watched him go through the front door, and then she drove off. So, about 30 minutes after he had left that second time, Austin walks back through the front doors of the restaurant. He's got a different shirt on, a different hat on, and he just walks to the back of the restaurant where his sister, his friend, and his father's girlfriend are, and he sits down, again, like nothing had ever happened. At first, it looks like everyone at the table is just silent. But then Austin's father very clearly said something to Austin, and it seems kind of hostile. It would turn out Austin's father, who loved his son dearly, was just totally at a loss for what to do with him. He was frustrated, scared, and confused. And he said to Austin when he sat back down, "What is wrong with you?" At this, Austin just stands up. He leans across the table and presses his father's face back up against his seat, kind of pinning him there. And then, at some point, he just lets go. He leaves the booth and he walks right out of the restaurant for a third and final time. Austin's friend, who was eating with them, he got up and kind of chased after Austin, but he was about 30 seconds behind him. So by the time he got outside, he didn't know where Austin went. He quickly came back into the restaurant and told the rest of the group he didn't know where Austin was. And so, at this point, Austin's father's girlfriend would actually call the police and report Austin missing. They knew he was totally unhinged, and they had no idea where he was going to go, if he was a threat to himself, or perhaps a threat to someone else. And so they figured they should just tell the police and have the police go find him. About 4 miles away from that restaurant, 3-year-old Michelle Mishkan was sitting in her garage watching TV. Normally, she would be joined by her husband, 9-year-old John Stevens, but he was out walking their dog. So, for the time being, Michelle was alone. The couple had been married for roughly 20 years. Between them, they had 3 children from previous marriages, and they were just totally and completely in love with each other. That garage was like their happy place. It was basically their living room. They loved having the big garage door wide open so they could wave to neighbors as they passed by and flag people down to come have a drink with them or just to chat for a while. They were known throughout the neighborhood as a very happy, loving couple that were just fun to be around. And according to their kids, they had both recently retired. John retired from his landscaping company that he owned, and Michelle retired from her job as a financial advisor. The two of them were apparently both just really excited about retirement life. They were excited to spend more time together and go out with their friends and go out fishing on their boat with their dog. And also to spend as much time as they could just lounging back in their garage. John and Michelle's neighbor, who lived directly across the street, was a middle-aged man named Jeff Fisher. Jeff was fairly close with the couple. He would usually watch their dogs for them anytime they went away on a trip, and he would often go over to their garage and have a drink and just kind of hang out with them. And so on this particular night, he was over in his house and he was planning on going to bed early. So he laid down in his bed, he's getting ready to go to sleep, when he hears some strange sounds coming from outside his window from across the street over near John and Michelle's property. So Jeff sits up in his bed and he kind of strains his ears to try to figure out what it was that he heard. And as he's trying to listen for some faint sound, he suddenly hears a blood-curdling scream, a woman's scream, coming from across the street. So Jeff instantly leapt into action. He jumped out of his bed, he ran downstairs, and he ran out his front door. And he looked across the street, and he saw this unknown man, some young man, that was slamming the car door of Michelle's car that was parked in her driveway. Then this man begins walking up the driveway. And at the top of the driveway, Jeff sees Michelle. She's standing in the garage, and she looks totally terrified. And she's facing this unknown young man. And of course, this unknown young man was Austin Haroof. Now, Jeff had no idea what was actually going on. All he knew was that he heard this terrifying scream, which was probably Michelle, and he's looking out there and he's seeing a situation that just doesn't look right. It doesn't look good at all. And so, instinctively, he decided he would just run across the street and make sure Michelle was okay. And if he had to, he would confront this unknown man, Austin. So Jeff begins running across his property, trying to get across the street to Michelle. But before he could even get all the way across the street, he's looking up and he can see this guy, Austin, has grabbed Michelle and thrown her on the ground. And now he's on top of her and he's beating her. So Jeff runs onto the driveway, and as he's going right up the driveway, between the two cars that were parked there, Austin leaps off of Michelle. He turns around and he looks directly at Jeff and he says, "You don't want a part of this." Now, Jeff, he's a pretty big guy himself. And so he's looking at Austin and he knows that if he doesn't do anything, this guy is just going to continue pummeling poor Michelle. and he had no idea where John was. So he ran up and kind of lunged at Austin, and as he did that, Austin swung and he hit Jeff right across the side of the head. But Jeff took the hit. He didn't fall down. He grabbed Austin by the collar and threw him as hard as he could to the ground. And Austin, he hit the pavement hard, face first. So Jeff is looking at this guy, kind of thinking he's not going to get up from that. But as he's assessing the situation, watching Austin start to stand back up again, Jeff suddenly feels a blinding pain in his face, in the side of his head, and his neck, on his back. He looks down, and he sees blood all over his arms. It's everywhere. He's covered in blood. It would turn out Austin was carrying a knife. And so when he had punched Jeff, that knife went into his face, it cut the side of his head, it cut his neck, and it cut his back. He had 5 different puncture points from that one single swing. And so Jeff believed in that moment that this was a potentially fatal wound. He was worried that perhaps his jugular had been struck and he was bleeding to death. And he's seeing Austin stand back up, coming right after him with this knife. And so Jeff decides their only chance is for him to run and call the police. And so he runs into Michelle's property. He's thinking that he's kind of drawing this guy towards him, away from Michelle. He runs into their property, kind of slams into all their doors. He goes out a back door, and then he loops around the property, and then he makes a run for it, straight across the street, back to his house. He never once turned around to see if this guy was after him. He just figured he was right behind him. He gets to his house, he runs inside, he locks the door, and then he calls 911. The operator asks if either of them are injured, and he says, yes, there's a girl laying on the ground, he beat her up, and then he says he ran over there, and he's bleeding profusely at the moment. The operator asks if he can tell if she's conscious, and he says no, it does not appear so, and that he's been stabbed in the back and is bleeding pretty bad. After the call is placed and Jeff is certain that help is on the way, he's barely conscious. But all he can remember thinking was, I hope this maniac Austin has abandoned his attack and just run off. Or I hope John has come outside and he's helping his wife. But unfortunately, all Jeff could hear was the sound of Austin across the street making these loud, animalistic grunting sounds. And at the same time, he hears the sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs. He doesn't even know if it's one person or 2 people, if it's male or female. All he hears is screams and grunting sounds. And then, seconds later, the police show up. The following narrative is the account of the second responding officer, who we'll just call Dan. The first responding officer we'll just call Kristen. And so Dan, he comes flying down the street, he's got his sirens on, and he pulls in right behind Kristen's cop car, which is parked right out in front of John and Michelle's property. Kristen is already running up the driveway, her gun is out, and she's getting ready to engage somebody at the top of the driveway. So Dan, he hops out of his car, he's got his hand on his gun, and as he turns to run up the driveway, his view is obscured. There are 2 cars parked in the driveway, and so he can't see what's at the top of the driveway that Kristen is apparently getting ready to draw her gun on. But as he begins running up the driveway, he sees there is this massive 6-foot wide stream of blood just coming down the driveway. So he goes around the left side of the left car, he goes up, and he sees Kristen right at the top of the driveway. She's got her gun aimed at the ground, right in front of the car. So he still can't see what's in front of the car yet. He comes bombing around the left side, right behind Kristen, and he looks down at what she's aiming her gun at. And he sees there's this man lying on the ground. His eyes are open. He's just laying there kind of stiff, and he's looking up at Kristen, he's looking up at Dan, and he's just quietly saying, "Please help me." The man on the ground was John Stevens. And on top of John Stevens was Austin. He was kind of laying sideways on John's chest. He had his left arm wrapped around John's neck to kind of hold him in place. And then he had his right arm, and he was doing something to John's face, but Dan couldn't really tell what he was doing. All he could take in was that there was clearly an aggressor, and they needed to get him off of the victim. But Kristen could not take the shot, because if she did, she ran the risk of firing the bullet through Austin and into John, killing John. So Dan tells Kristen, hold on, I'm going to tase him. And so he moves around Kristen to her left side, so he's positioned looking down at the back of Austin. He pulls out his taser. And right before he shoots his taser into Austin's back, he sees what Austin is doing to John's face with his free right hand. He was reaching into John's mouth and pulling his cheek out, kind of like a fish hook. He was pulling it out as far as he could, and then he was biting into John's cheek, and he was ripping out pieces of flesh and chewing and swallowing them. And from his position, Dan only saw this for a second, but he suddenly noticed, and Kristen, the other officer, would later confirm, there were all these chunks already missing from John's face. So Dan kind of snapped out of what he was seeing and fired his taser into the back of Austin. But it did nothing. It had absolutely no effect. Austin was entirely focused on biting John's face. That was all he was doing. He wasn't even registering that there were cops with their guns drawn on him. It was like they weren't even there. And so Dan runs back around Kristen to the other side of her. He's now on her right side, so he's standing right next to the car, looking down at Austin's front. He tells Kristen to kind of back up for a second, and then Dan winds up and kicks Austin square in the face, knocking his head off of John's face. But as soon as Austin's head comes off of John, he doesn't get up and try to fight with Dan. Instead, he just jumps back down, gets a deeper grip on John, and plunges his mouth back onto John's face. And so again, Dan winds up and boots Austin square in the face, knocking his head back. But again, he's totally unfazed. He doesn't want to attack the officers. He just wants to eat John's face. And so he goes right back down, gets a tighter grip, he goes back, and he starts chewing on John's face again. And so Dan was just repeatedly kicking him in the face over and over and over again. Right as this is happening, another set of officers showed up, and they had a canine. They had a dog. And so they come flying up, they kind of see the situation, and Dan tells them, release the dog. And so, sure enough, they release the canine. The canine clamps down on Austin's right arm, the arm that was fish hooking and kind of pulling John's face out. And the dog really got a good bite on his arm and yanked it away from John's face. But Austin just instantly ripped his arm back, doing severe damage to his own arm from the dog's teeth, and just repositioned himself and went back to biting John's face. And so the dog, just as it was trained, did another bite. It grabbed back onto Austin's arm, and it pulled it off of John's body. And so his arm is back like this again. And Austin, again, completely unfazed, just yanked his arm out of the dog's teeth again, shredding the muscles of his arm, and gets back in position and continues to eat John's face. And then finally, the dog gets another bite into Austin's arm. And this time, when the dog managed to yank Austin's arm away from John, Dan timed it, so he booted Austin square in the face right as his arm was being pulled back. And he hit him hard enough that Austin actually flew off of John and landed on his back. And as soon as he was on the ground, Dan actually leapt over John and landed on Austin's face, smashing his head into the cement, which kind of stunned him for a second. And as soon as he was stunned, Dan whipped out his handcuffs, threw it over one of Austin's wrists, and began pulling him by the handcuff up the driveway away from John. But as soon as he had some separation and Dan went to put the other handcuff on Austin, Austin began fighting back. And he looked up at Dan and he screamed, "Kill me! I'm eating humans! Kill me!" Dan didn't even know what to do. And so he's trying to put the other handcuff on him, and the whole time Austin is screaming, "Kill me! Kill me!" And so other officers had to run in, and then finally, after 3 other officers came over, they were able to hold Austin down long enough to get both handcuffs on him. After Austin was finally restrained, the officers checked on the victims. They checked on Michelle, who was in the garage, and unfortunately, she was deceased. She had died from blunt force trauma. And John, even though he had been alive when the police first showed up, he had succumbed to the multitude of injuries he had sustained, from stabbings to beatings to having a portion of his face ripped off. It's believed that after John came back from his walk, which would have been right after Jeff had been attacked, and ran back to his house, John saw Austin in his garage attacking his wife, and John ran in to try to save her. So ultimately, John would die trying to save the woman that he loved. Their dog would survive the attack, it was unharmed, and was given to one of their children to take care of. And Jeff Fisher, the neighbor who tried to save John and Michelle, he would survive the attack and make a full recovery. After Austin was finally handcuffed and was lying restrained on the driveway, he suddenly became unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital, where it was determined that he had drank some poisonous chemicals, most likely from inside of John and Michelle's garage, and that was what was causing his organs to fail. Ultimately, Austin would go into a coma for 11 days from whatever he ingested. But the doctors were able to save his life, and so he would come out of that coma and he would make a full physical recovery. It was initially assumed that because of Austin's known drug abuse history, he must have been on some kind of powerful drug when he perpetrated this heinous crime. It was speculated that he could have been on bath salts or flakka, which are these synthetic hallucinogenic drugs, which are very powerful. And at the time, they were quite popular in Florida and had caused some other users to go on these kind of wild, violent rampages. And so it seemed to make a lot of sense that he must have been on one of those. But when Austin's toxicology report finally came back, it showed he only had a very small amount of THC in his system, which is the drug found in marijuana. And the other drugs that were in his system were all induced by the doctors and nurses at the hospital. Which meant at the time of this horrific attack, Austin was effectively sober. When the police asked Austin, "Why did you do this?" he initially said, "I don't remember. I don't know." But eventually, he would open up and he would tell this story that no sane person could possibly understand. He said that after he left that restaurant where his family was that third time, after he fought with his father and he stormed out, after that he saw this dark figure outside with a white face. And he knew immediately that this figure was evil. And so instinctively, Austin began running away from this evil figure. And so he ran for about 4 miles into John and Michelle's neighborhood. And when he got to this neighborhood, a neighborhood he was not familiar with, that he didn't intend to go to on purpose, he just kind of wound up there. He said he saw this brightly lit up garage, and he ran up into it, believing he could enlist the help of the people inside of this house, and that they would help him defeat this evil figure that was lurking somewhere nearby. And so he runs up into this garage, which happens to be John and Michelle's garage, and Michelle is in there. John is not. He's out for the walk with his dog. And Austin approaches her and tries to get her to help him. But he probably came off looking completely insane. And Michelle screamed. At which point, Austin said he believed Michelle was a witch. And so he pulled out his knife and he attacked her. And then after she fell to the ground, Austin said he drank a bottle of alcohol or something, which we now know was most likely very poisonous lawn chemicals that was just sitting in the garage. After he drinks that bottle, he turns around and now he's looking out of the garage towards the street. And he said he saw this other figure in the doorway with a dog next to him. And then Austin said his mind just went blank. It's believed the figure he saw in the doorway was John Stevens returning from his walk. But we don't know for sure. And frankly, this story is pretty incoherent to begin with because it doesn't account for the fact that before John came back, Austin had been grappling with Jeff Fisher and stabbing Jeff Fisher, the neighbor. But Austin would say he has no recollection of encountering Jeff Fisher. He has no recollection of John or what he looked like. And he certainly doesn't remember biting John's face. And he had no memory of any interactions with police. He said that basically he turned around, he sees this figure, this dog, and then his mind went blank. And then he woke up about 2 weeks later in the hospital. Now, when his story went public, a lot of people just were not willing to accept that story. They said he was making it up so he could plead insanity at his trial and get a lesser sentence. But a world-renowned forensic psychologist named Dr. Philip Resnick, who had worked on many high-profile cases before, he did a lengthy assessment of Austin. And he came to a very different conclusion than the public. In his 8-page report, Resnick points out the fact that Austin continued to bite John's face even when he was being openly threatened with being shot by the police officer standing right over him. He continued to bite John's face after he was tased. He continued to bite John's face after he was kicked in the head repeatedly. He continued to bite John's face after a police dog repeatedly bit him. This all suggests that Austin was truly in a psychotic state when this attack occurred. A sane person, even under the influence of drugs, will retain a basic survival instinct. They will try to protect themselves. So when there are guns pointed at them, or they're being physically harmed, or there are threats of violence, they'll do things to protect themselves. But Austin didn't. It was like he had no idea about anything else in the world except John's face. Resnick specified that the type of psychotic episode that Austin was suffering from on the night of the attack is something called clinical lycanthropy delusions. Clinical lycanthropy is a very rare occurrence where an individual believes they are no longer human. And almost always what they believe they are is something akin to a werewolf. And in Austin's case, it's not that hard to figure out why you might reach that type of conclusion. He had told his sister earlier that day that he believed he was half horse. And then on a couple of other occasions, he had told his other friends that he believed he was half dog. And then, of course, on the night of the attack, after he killed Michelle, he pounced literally on John and began eating his face while making those loud animalistic grunting sounds. This is behavior that is certainly on par with what you would expect a werewolf to do in a movie, but this was not a movie. This was real life. After Austin came out of his coma, but before he had been transferred to jail, he agreed to do an interview with the clinical psychologist and TV personality Phil McGraw, better known as Dr. Phil. And during their 10-minute Zoom interview, Austin would break down and cry and say he was incredibly sorry to the family of the victims, that he didn't really know why it happened, and that clearly there was something wrong with him and he needed help. And he just hoped they could find it in their hearts to eventually forgive him. But it's unlikely the family of the victims are going to forgive him anytime soon. Especially when you consider they came out in an interview and said, "I hope Austin makes a full recovery from his coma, that he has no brain damage, that he is totally A-OK, so he can be fully aware and lucid when they read him his sentence." A sentence they hoped would be the death penalty. As of right now, though, the family of the victims will just have to keep on waiting, because Austin is still in jail awaiting trial. Thanks for watching. Cases like this are disturbing not just because of the violence, but because they force us to confront how terrifying the human mind can become when reality completely breaks apart. 2 innocent people lost their lives that night, a family was destroyed forever, and the questions surrounding what truly happened inside Austin Harrouff's mind still remain deeply unsettling to this day. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check out our other true crime stories next. And as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Until next time. Somewhere deep in a forest in France, a girl began to realize something was wrong. At first, it was just the sound of a bell ringing somewhere between the trees. And every time she stopped to listen, it would disappear like it was never there at all. But the deeper she went into the forest, the more certain she became of one thing. Something was there with her just out of sight. In June of 2019, an 18-year-old girl named Bella was finishing up her first year of college. She was excited to head home for the summer. Her family lived on the outskirts of a small town in France, a place tucked away in the mountains and almost completely surrounded by a massive, dense forest. Growing up there, Bella had spent a huge amount of her childhood exploring that forest. Sometimes she would go by herself, other times with her father, or maybe with her cousins. Over the years, she had come to know the woods like the back of her hand. She knew every trail, every landmark, every quiet little spot. Her absolute favorite place in this entire forest was a small, man-made lake that was situated deep inside, almost at the very center of the woods. It wasn't a very large lake, but the view was breathtaking and it was always incredibly peaceful. It was her go-to spot to clear her head. Getting there was a little ritual she had perfected over the years. She would leave her house, get into her small car, and drive for a couple of miles down a quiet country road. At a very specific, unmarked spot, she would pull over onto the gravel shoulder. There were no signs, no designated parking area. It was just a place she and her family had discovered, a hidden gateway to their part of the forest. After parking, she'd get out, and instead of walking along the road, she would turn and walk directly into the line of trees that grew right up against the shoulder. The underbrush was thick for the first few feet, but it quickly opened up into a small clearing. Just ahead, she would see a little stream trickling through the woods. To the left of this stream, there was what looked like a worn-out footpath, but it wasn't a human trail. It was an animal trail, a path carved out over years and years by deer and other wildlife making their way through the forest. Bella would walk down to this animal path and follow it as it ran parallel to the stream. She'd walk for about 15 or 20 minutes, just enjoying the quiet sounds of nature until the path took a sharp turn to the left, heading away from the water. At that point, Bella would leave the animal trail behind. She'd continue walking straight, following the stream north, deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest. This part of the journey involved stepping carefully on mossy rocks in the stream and walking along the muddy banks on either side. It was a slower pace, and it would take her about an hour of steady walking before the stream eventually met up with a much larger river that ran from east to west. When she reached this river, Bella would turn left, heading west, and follow the riverbank for another 20 minutes or so. And then, finally, the river would open up and feed directly into her destination, the man-made lake. She would find a comfortable rock to sit on, watch the animals, listen to the wind in the trees, and just feel totally at peace. To get back, she would just retrace her steps exactly. The whole trip, one way, from her car to the lake, took about 2 hours. A big part of why Bella loved this place so much was because it felt like it belonged to her and her family. In all her years of coming out here, the only other people she had ever seen in this part of the forest or anywhere near the lake were members of her own family. It was their secret, their private sanctuary. So, in June of that year, when Bella finally came home from college, one of the first things she wanted to do was go out to the lake. She hadn't been in months because of school, and she was really missing her happy place. One morning, she got up early, told her parents where she was headed, and set out by herself. She got in her car, drove the familiar couple of miles, and pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. She got out, turned away from the road, and walked into the forest. She found the stream, then the animal path beside it. She walked for a few minutes until the trail cut to the left, and just as she always did, she stayed with the stream, continuing her journey north. About 30 minutes later, when she was still a good mile or two away from the east-west river, she heard something. It was a bell. Somewhere off in the distance, far ahead of her, she heard a single, clear chime. As soon as she heard it, she stopped dead in her tracks. That was wrong. There were never any people out here. Ever. And that sound, a bell, had to come from a person or something a person had made. She stood perfectly still, listening, wondering if she had imagined it. It could have just been a strange sound, her mind playing tricks on her in the silence of the woods. She waited. And then she heard it again. But this time, it wasn't a single chime. The bell started ringing continuously. It wasn't a steady, rhythmic ringing, though. It was sporadic and uneven, almost frantic, like someone holding a bell and just shaking it randomly at a sports game. Her mind started racing, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe a dog had gotten lost out here and it had a bell on its collar. But as she listened, she realized the sound was too loud, too resonant. It wasn't the tiny jingle of a pet's bell. This was something bigger, more substantial. She thought of other, stranger possibilities. Maybe someone had a bell in a box, and the box fell into the river upstream and was now floating down, hitting rocks and causing the sound. She was coming up with all these weird scenarios, but honestly, she wasn't scared. She was just incredibly curious. Since the sound of the bell seemed to be coming from the direction she was already heading, she decided to just keep walking. She wanted to see for herself what was making that noise. So Bella started walking along the stream again, her ears tuned to the constant random ringing up ahead. She was completely focused on it, trying to pinpoint its exact location. And then, after about 5 more minutes of walking, the bell just stopped. It went completely silent. The sudden absence of the sound was actually more startling than the sound itself. She stopped again, listening intently, expecting it to start up again, but it didn't. All she could hear now were the normal sounds of the forest, the stream, the birds, the wind. Bella had no explanation for the bell or why it had stopped, but she wasn't really worried about it. She figured there had to be a logical explanation for it, even if she couldn't think of one. So she just shrugged it off, put her focus back on her hike, and kept walking toward the lake. About 10 or 15 minutes later, Bella was still making her way along the stream. She was getting closer to the East-West River, maybe only a half-mile away now. That's when she saw something up ahead on the left bank of the stream. It was a dark lump on the ground. At first, she couldn't tell what it was. It could have been a strangely shaped rock or maybe an animal. As she got closer, she realized it was a beaver lying motionless on the ground, and this beaver was missing its head. Now, this was a huge forest, and Bella knew perfectly well that it was full of wild animals. Finding the body of an animal that had been killed by a predator wasn't unusual. That was just nature. But as she stood over it, something struck her as deeply wrong. The cut on the beaver's neck was incredibly neat and uniform. It looked like its head had been very carefully removed with an extremely sharp knife. And the beaver's head was nowhere in sight. This definitely didn't look like the work of a predator. The teeth and claws of an animal would have left a ragged, torn mess. Also, the rest of the beaver's body was completely untouched. Whatever had killed it clearly wasn't interested in eating it. As Bella stood there staring down at the bizarre sight, she also noticed there was no smell. Usually, when an animal dies, the process of decomposition starts quickly and it creates a very distinct odor. The lack of any smell told Bella that this beaver must have been killed very, very recently. Then she gently nudged the body with the toe of her shoe and saw that it was still fairly limp. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of the body that happens shortly after death, hadn't set in yet. As all these facts clicked into place in her mind, a cold realization washed over her. This beaver had died only a short time ago, which meant that whoever or whatever had killed it was probably still somewhere nearby. And then Bella couldn't help but connect the dead beaver to the bell she had heard earlier. Before, the bell was just a curiosity. But now, considering the sound had come from the same general area where this freshly killed and decapitated beaver was now lying, it made her deeply uneasy. Her head snapped up, and she found herself frantically scanning the trees, her eyes darting in every direction. She was looking for a person, maybe a hunter, someone who could explain what was going on. But she saw nothing. There was no movement, no sound, just the dense, silent woods. She felt a wave of panic begin to rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stop. She took a deep breath and told herself to calm down. It was broad daylight. She had been coming to these woods her entire life and had never seen another person, never had a dangerous encounter with an animal. She was sure everything was fine. She had to be overreacting. She had nothing to worry about. So, she took another deep breath, carefully stepped over the beaver's body, and kept on walking. Eventually, Bella reached the East-West River. She made the left turn and walked the final 20 minutes along its bank until she reached the man-made lake. She sat for a while, enjoying the beautiful view and the familiar scenery, trying to push the image of the beaver out of her mind. After some time, she got up, turned around, and began the long walk back. She passed the spot where the beaver was still lying on the ground, walked all the way back to her car, and went home, feeling a little unsettled, but mostly okay. A week went by. Bella was at home feeling bored and restless. On an impulse, she decided that the only cure for her boredom was a trip back to the place she loved most, the man-made lake. She told her parents where she was going, and then she left the house. It was already 6 in the evening when she got in her car, drove to the pull-off, parked, and entered the woods. Sunset that night was at 9, so Bella knew she couldn't linger. This would have to be a quick trip if she wanted to avoid being caught in the forest after dark. She found the animal trail and started her journey along the stream. She followed it until the trail veered left, and then she continued along the stream bed. As she was walking, she started to hear the distant rumble of thunder. She looked up through the canopy of leaves and could see the sky was growing dark, much darker than it should be. It was still a couple of hours before sunset, so she knew a storm was rolling in. But Bella was determined. She was not going to turn back. She wanted to get to that lake. So instead of heading back to her car, she did the opposite. She started jogging along the stream, trying to get there as fast as she possibly could. Almost as soon as she picked up her pace, the first raindrops began to fall. By the time she passed the spot where the beaver corpse had been lying on the ground, it hadn't moved, the rain was really coming down. About 15 minutes after she passed the corpse, she finally reached the East-West River. By this point, the rain had turned into a full-blown downpour. Still, Bella was resolute. She turned left at the river and continued west, intending to go all the way to the lake. But after only a minute or two of walking along the river, with about 20 minutes still left to go, she stopped herself. She looked at her watch and saw that it was already after 8 o'clock. She started thinking it through logically. If she turned around right now, it would still take her over an hour to get back to her car. Sunset was at 9. It was already past 8. That meant, best case scenario, she was going to have to navigate the last part of her journey in the dark. And if she went all the way to the lake first, then she would be walking in the pitch-black forest for maybe up to an hour. She was confident she could probably do it, but it was also pouring rain and she was cold and soaked. If she got lost or twisted an ankle, this could turn into a very bad situation very quickly. So, as much as she wanted to keep going, she made the sensible decision. She needed to turn around and head back. She turned and began walking back along the East-West River toward the spot where the stream fed into it. She turned south and started making her way along the stream back toward her car. Because it was getting so dark and the rain was so heavy, visibility was terrible. She kept her head down, watching the ground, trying not to trip. She was carefully placing her feet on rocks and muddy patches, making sure her footing was solid. The rain was pounding all around her. She had been walking like this for about 15 minutes when, all of a sudden, something hit her hard on the top of her head. Reflexively, she cried out and looked up, throwing her hands in front of her face to protect herself. And then she saw what she had just run into. It was the beaver corpse. It was hanging from a string, dangling from a tree branch directly over the path. And its head, which had been missing before, had been found. It had been crudely stitched onto the beaver's own front paws. So she was looking at this grotesque, dangling puppet of a beaver carrying its own head, and she had walked right into it. Her first reaction was to gag. She felt like she was going to vomit right there. She was so disgusted. Then she started frantically rubbing at her hair where the wet, decomposing thing had touched her, terrified that some fluid from it had gotten on her. After a moment of panicked scrubbing, she stopped. And something truly terrifying dawned on her. Whoever had strung this beaver up in this tree and had taken the time to stitch its head onto its paws had done it in the last 30 minutes. Because just 30 minutes earlier, on her way in, she specifically remembered seeing the beaver carcass on the ground. She saw it. It was in the same spot it had been a week ago. And now, here it was, hanging from a tree. As the wheels turned in her head, Bella came to a chilling conclusion. If someone had just done this, then that someone was probably still here. They were probably nearby. At this point, it was getting really dark. The rain was hammering down, and she felt completely exposed. She started whipping her head around, trying to peer through the downpour into the dark woods, searching for anyone who might have done this. But all she could see was the dark, blurry shape of the forest in every direction. She knew she was at least an hour away from her car, even if she ran. Suddenly, she was totally and completely panicked. In a desperate effort to calm herself down, she whispered to herself, "Okay, I need to get out of here, but I have to walk. If I start running, I'll fall, I'll get lost, this will turn into a nightmare. Just walk. Try to walk." So she took a shaky breath, walked around the dangling beaver corpse, and started moving along the stream again. But as soon as she was past it, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She could hear movement behind her. A rustling sound. She didn't know what it was. It could have been a deer, just some animal startled by the storm. But she was far too afraid to turn around and look. And even though she was telling herself to stay calm, to just keep walking, that she was safe and just freaking herself out, she could feel her pace quickening. Her walk turned into a jog, and then finally she broke into a full-on sprint, running down the stream away from that beaver and whatever was moving in the trees behind her. At some point, maybe 5 or 6 minutes after seeing the beaver, she was so out of breath from sprinting that she had to slow down to a walk. As soon as she slowed down, still without turning around, she heard it again. The sound of that bell. It was the exact same sound she had heard the week before, that constant, sporadic ringing. But in her panic state, she couldn't tell where it was coming from. Her anxiety was so high, her heart was pounding so loud, she didn't know if it was behind her, or to the side, or all around her. It was now completely dark, and she was full-blown terrified. There was someone or something behind her, the person who had strung up that beaver, and they were probably watching her right now. Even though she was beyond exhausted and could barely breathe, she started sprinting again as fast as her legs would carry her. She stumbled and fell on the slippery rocks. She tripped over roots, not even looking where she was going anymore. And in the background, all around her, she could hear that bell chiming, and she could hear something crashing through the woods behind her. She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out her iPhone. As she was running, she managed to dial her father. She pressed the phone to her ear, crying, panting, gasping for air. Her father picked up, and she was so relieved to hear his voice, but she couldn't even form a sentence. She just started wailing, pleading with him. "Dad, come out to the forest! Meet me at the spot where the trail veers away from the stream. Meet me there! There's someone in the forest, they're chasing me, and I can't see them!" Her father, on the other end of the line, didn't know what to make of it, but he could hear the pure primal fear in his daughter's voice. He didn't waste time with questions. He just said, "Stay on the line. I'm coming to meet you right now." Bella's father and mother, with Bella still on the phone with them, ran out of their house. They jumped in their car and sped the couple of miles down the road. They parked next to their daughter's car, and as they were getting out, they could hear it. Way off in the woods, they could hear the faint sound of the bell. They could hear their daughter screaming on the phone, and they could hear that same bell sound coming through the phone's speaker. She was begging them, "Please, come into the woods, come in here, save me." Her parents ran into the woods and started charging up the stream. Meanwhile, Bella was still deep in the forest, still 10 or 15 minutes away from them. She could barely run anymore. She had used up almost all of her energy. And as she got closer and closer to where her parents would be, the sporadic ringing of the bell was getting louder and louder and louder. Whatever it was gaining on her. She could hear sticks and branches snapping right behind her, as if something was just feet away. Finally, when it felt like the bell was ringing right behind her head, she just stopped. It was a moment of complete defeat. She was too far away from her parents. She wasn't going to make it to them in time. It was almost as if she felt she had no choice but to turn around and finally see whatever it was that was hunting her. So, terrified beyond words, so scared and so tired she could barely breathe, Bella slowly turned around. When she turned, she found herself facing a small clearing she had just run past. Because it was a clearing, a little bit of moonlight was able to filter down through the trees, just enough to illuminate the space, which was about 50 feet across. As she looked across this clearing, at first she saw nothing. And then a tall, dark figure walked into the clearing from the trees on the other side. As soon as it stepped into the faint light, she could see it had a bell tied at its waist. With every single step it took, its leg would strike the bell, causing that violent ringing sound. This thing started moving across the clearing, and as Bella stared at it, it was like time slowed down. She couldn't process what she was seeing. She didn't know what it was. All she knew was that whatever or whoever this was, it was coming straight for her. And then, suddenly, Bella felt an unbelievable rush of adrenaline. It was like her body went into autopilot, a pure survival instinct. She turned around and began sprinting faster than she had ever sprinted in her entire life. And as she ran, all she could hear was the sound of that bell, which she now understood was the sound of its steps. The bell was getting faster and faster, louder and louder. She knew it was gaining on her. She started screaming out loud, lying, "I'm on the phone with the police! They're right up ahead. They're going to be here any second." But whatever was behind her wasn't fazed. It just kept charging forward, closing the distance second by second. Meanwhile, her parents had made it to the meeting spot. But her father couldn't just stand there and wait. He started charging deeper into the woods towards the sounds. He could hear his daughter's screams, he could hear the bell getting louder and louder, and he just ran straight towards it. And sure enough, just seconds later, he saw his daughter compounding out of the dark forest. She saw him and leaped into his arms. He grabbed her, turned around, and ran with her back to the meeting spot. He grabbed his wife, and the three of them just charged out of the forest, back to the parking lot, back into their car. And they sped away. In the car, all of them were crying. They had no idea what to make of what had just happened. Bella was trying to describe what she saw, but she couldn't get the words out. Her parents had been on the phone listening to their daughter's terrified screams, and all they kept saying to each other was, "I heard the bell. I heard the bell. I heard the bell." That sound confirmed their worst nightmares. There really was someone or something out in those woods that was trying to harm their child. They drove straight to the police station, where Bella filed a report about everything she had experienced in the forest. Afterwards, as a precaution, her parents took her to the hospital. She was determined to be physically okay, besides some bumps and bruises from falling. The following morning, the police went out to the forest. They went to the area Bella had described and conducted a thorough search all along the animal trail and the stream. But they never found any sign of this tall, dark figure with the bell. Bella had told the police that she was carrying a handbag and that she had dropped it while she was running. She remembered exactly where along the stream she had dropped it, but when the police searched that area, the bag was gone. Also, the beaver was no longer there. It wasn't tied to the tree, and it wasn't on the ground. It had vanished. The only thing the police found that was out of the ordinary was a t-shirt. A little ways off from the stream, basically along the path Bella would have been running, they found a t-shirt that was neatly folded and placed carefully underneath a rock. But the police, Bella and her family, had no idea what that was supposed to mean. Ultimately, the police told Bella and her family that more than likely what she had run into was some kind of mentally unstable person who was living out in the woods. Perhaps when Bella came into the forest, this person felt like she was trespassing on their property, and so they tried to scare her away. But Bella has a very hard time accepting that explanation. She felt with every fiber of her being that as she was running from whoever was behind her, she was in mortal danger. She believes that if her father hadn't run into the woods and literally grabbed her and carried her the rest of the way, she might not have gotten out of there at all. She might have been attacked and killed by whatever that was. And when she looks back on the experience, she can't help but think about that moment when she turned around and looked across that clearing. When she saw that figure step into the moonlight for the first time, she remembers that the way it was moving, the steps it was taking, they weren't normal. They were abnormal, disjointed. There was something so off about its movement that for a second, it didn't even seem like she was looking at a person, but maybe some kind of large animal. Since her ordeal, there have been no other strange sightings reported in those woods. But then again, almost no one ever goes into that part of the forest except for Bella and her family. And Bella and her family, they don't go in those woods anymore. So whoever or whatever is out there is still just out there. The police never found anyone or anything in that forest. No trace of the shadow. No trace of the beaver. Nothing. It's just an empty forest and the sound of a bell that no one can fully explain. To this day, Bella and her family refuse to ever go near that forest again, because anything out there has never proven that it has left. The 1st of October, 2010. It is 5:30 o'clock. A group of 4 people were gathered around a campfire that was filling with the sound of crackling woods deep within the towering pine forests of Mount Shasta, California. The autumn sun was rapidly setting below the ridge, and the shadows were stretching out across their secluded campsite. The air was crisp, and the sun was setting quickly. All of the things seemed to be perfectly and blissfully normal. There was a young boy who was 3.5 years old sitting right next to his older sister while they were playing in the dirt. In order to get a piece of firewood, the sister turned her back on her younger brother for a brief period of time, which was nothing more than 3 seconds. After turning around, she found that the area next to her was completely devoid of any occupants. There were no sounds of rustling leaves, crying, or footsteps that were beginning to fade away. Simply a suffocating silence that ensued immediately. When his sister called his name, she was under the impression that he was hiding behind a nearby tree and playing hide and seek, but no one responded. Her calls, which were initially considered to be casual, quickly escalated into frantic screams, which prompted their parents to rush over. As they made their way through the immediate perimeter, their flashlights were able to cut through the growing darkness. However, the boy had completely disappeared into thin air. The local authorities were immediately notified, and what followed was a massive search and rescue operation with a lot of stakes involved. Hundreds of trained searchers, K-9 units, and volunteers combed through every square inch of the terrain for a period of 5 agonizing hours. As they made their way up and down the primary hiking trails, they did so while shining powerful spotlights into the dense vegetation. On the other hand, the tracking dogs were unable to detect any scent, and the wilderness continued to be as silent as ever. Then, at approximately 5 minutes past the hour, a search team that was making their way down a primary trail came to a complete and utter halt. The young boy was found there, tucked away inside a dense bush that was situated directly on the shoulder of the path. What's the strange part? Only a few minutes earlier, this particular trail had been thoroughly searched by a number of different teams using flashlights, and there was not a single person discovered along it. It was almost as if he had been brought back to the grid in terms of his physical presence. Everyone's feelings of relief were so overwhelming that they hardly had time to process the sheer impossibility of the situation when the rescuers finally managed to pull him out of the water. The boy did not sustain any injuries at all. Even though the night air was extremely cold at a high altitude, he did not even shiver. He did not have a single scratch on his face, his clothes were not torn by the thick briars, and he were not even scratching his face. At the hospital, the doctors examined him and discovered that there was nothing wrong with his health. He was just a toddler who was shaken but physically intact. When the family finally made it back to their house, they were filled with gratitude and prepared to simply chalk it up to a terrifying anomaly and move on with their lives. However, what they did not realize was that the true horror of Mount Shasta had not even begun to unfold, and the boy's eventual explanation would shatter any illusion that the incident was a typical accident that occurred in the surrounding wilderness. If you want to comprehend how a child of 3 years old could disappear in the blink of an eye and then reappear without any injuries, you need to have an understanding of the family in question. It was not the case that they were careless tourists or novice hikers. The parents were seasoned outdoor enthusiasts who had spent years traversing the treacherous terrains of Northern California amidst their experiences. Due to the fact that they were aware of the dangers that could be posed by wild animals, terrain drop-offs, and sudden weather shifts, they made sure to keep a close eye on their children. Mount Shasta, a majestic snow-capped volcano that rises over 14,000 feet, was known to the locals as a place of immense natural beauty. However, in more shadowy circles, it was also whispered about as a geographical hotspot for unexplained disappearances. Mount Shasta was their sanctuary. He was not the type of person to wander off into pitch-black woods by himself, and he certainly did not possess the survival skills necessary to navigate a dense forest in the dark for 5 hours without suffering a single injury. The young boy was bright, full of energy, and extremely attached to his family, particularly to his grandmother, whom he affectionately called Cappy. While the searchers are gathering their belongings, the sheriff's department is under the impression that the initial official hypothesis is extremely straightforward. They believe that the child simply experienced a sudden surge of toddler curiosity, walked past the perimeter of the campsite, and quickly became disoriented as a result of the rapid onset of twilight. When it is dark, it is easy for a child to make a mistake, fall into a natural depression or a thicket, and then hunker down out of fear. Because the forest floor was uneven and heavily forested, the search teams believed that they had simply missed him during the first few sweeps. Alternatively, they believed that the boy had been migrating through the woods and had only stumbled onto the side of the trail right before he was found. The theory was reassuring and logical, and it brought the investigation to a satisfying conclusion in a neat little bow as well. However, the issue with this theory was the lack of physical evidence, or more accurately, the complete absence of such evidence. A 3-year-old boy was able to break through a dense wall of thorny brush without leaving a single trace of clothing, fiber, or a scratch on his bare skin. There were no tracking signs, no dirt that had been displaced, and there was no logical explanation for how this accomplishment could have occurred. His entire being had been consumed by the wilderness, and when it finally expelled him, it left behind a mystery that a straightforward, accidental, wandering theory could never hope to explain. The words of the boy himself were the catalyst that caused this reassuring official theory to completely disintegrate, and it was only 3 weeks later that this statement was made. He was spending the afternoon with his grandmother, who was the real Cappy, when all of a sudden he looked up at her, his face becoming extremely serious, and said, "I don't like the other Cappy." After a moment of complete and utter unease, The grandmother froze and asked him what on earth he was talking about. With the limited but descriptive vocabulary of a child of 3.5 years old, the young boy started to piece together a story that was so specific and so chilling that it could not be simply dismissed as the overactive imagination of a toddler. As a matter of fact, he had attempted to convey this very same narrative to his father right after the rescue, but his father had dismissed it as the incoherent ramblings of a child who had been traumatized. The fact that the boy had not altered a single aspect of his account was not brought to the attention of the grandmother until she compared notes with the father. It was the boy's assertion that he had not wandered off without any reason. He stated that he looked up while he was playing by the campfire and saw his grandmother, Cappy, standing at the edge of the dark tree line, smiling and waving at him to come with her. He claimed that during this time, he was able to see her. He got up and walked straight into the woods in the direction of her because he loved and trusted her as much as he could possibly be. He stated that the other Cappy took him by the hand and led him up a steep hill deep into the mountain until they reached the entrance of a cave that was dark and cold. The boy noticed that the environment was extremely strange as soon as they entered the cave. The floor of the cave was crawling with spiders, and there were purses belonging to women scattered all over the ground. However, the moment he turned around to look up at his guide was when the real terror struck. It dawned on him that the person who was looking back at him, that was not his grandmother. It was then that the head of this entity started to emit a glowing light that was not natural. It was a fake at that point. According to the boy, this other Cappy sat him down and started asking him a never-ending stream of questions, interrogating him about things that he was unable to comprehend. When the boy was unable to provide the answers, the entity became visibly frustrated and detached from the situation. When the creature abruptly pushed the child back out of the cave entrance, it was because it had realized that the child was of no use. The boy claimed that the moment he was thrust out of the cavern, he lost consciousness, and the very next thing he remembered was waking up, cooped up inside the thicket on the side of the trail, right where the searchers found him. Due to the revelation, the family was rendered completely helpless. On the night of the disappearance, the real Cappy was located hundreds of miles away, and there were no reports of anyone in the area who matched the description of the grandmother. This is the most important fact. Suddenly, the medical reports from the night he was discovered took on a much more sinister tone. His absence of hypothermia, his flawless, scratch-free skin, and the fact that he was dropped on a trail that had been searched just minutes earlier all aligned perfectly with the boy's timeline, which stated that he had not been surviving in the woods for 5 hours. He had been transported to a completely different location. Nevertheless, the moment that the real Cappy heard this story was the moment that the family reached their absolute breaking point. It was the moment that they realized that this was much more than a single kidnapping or a nightmare for a child. As the specifics of the cave, the peculiar interrogation, and the glowing head began to sink in, she experienced a wave of icy dread that washed over her. As she watched her son, who was the boy's father, she came to the realization that she could no longer conceal a secret that she had been keeping hidden for exactly 1 year. In the exact same campground on Mount Shasta, exactly 1 year prior to her grandson's disappearance, she admitted that she too had experienced a terrifying and unexplained encounter. A close male friend had been accompanying her on a camping trip. While they were sitting by their campfire late that night, Cappy became aware of a pair of glowing red eyes that were staring at them from the depths of the forest when they were there. Due to the fact that she and her friend were both seasoned outdoorsmen, they assumed that it was a dangerous animal, such as a mountain lion or a bear. In order to illuminate the eyes, they quickly grabbed their powerful flashlights and pointed them in that direction. However, the eyes simply disappeared into nothingness the moment the light struck the spot where they were located. Throughout the subsequent few hours, the entity engaged in a sickening game of cat and mouse, making appearances in various locations around the perimeter of the area concerned. There was no way that they could ever illuminate a physical body regardless of how quickly they swung their lights. The sound of rustling brush and snapping twigs was not audible for some reason. It is only the eyes. Both Cappy and her friend eventually retreated, Cappy to her tent and her friend to his camper. They were absolutely terrified and extremely unsettled. The events that followed defy any and all attempts at medical and logical explanation. On the following morning, Cappy awoke with her face down in the dirt, completely outside of her tent that had been zipped up. Her body was racked with a severe and unnatural feeling of nausea, and she felt violently ill. It was a strange and distinct puncture wound on the back of her neck that she discovered when she reached up to soothe a sharp and burning pain at the base of her skull. Her fingers came away bloody. As she stumbled to her feet, she turned her head to look at the camper and saw her friend lying face down in the dirt outside of his vehicle, having been in the exact same condition. Furthermore, he too was experiencing severe illness, and he too had a puncture wound that was identical to the one that was located on his neck. At the time, they attempted to find a way to make sense of the horror. They convinced themselves that they must have been bitten by an unidentified species of spider that was extremely toxic, which caused them to become delirious, hallucinate, and wander out of their shelters into the dirt. However, after hearing her grandson, who was 3 years old, describe an entity that stole her identity, a cave filled with women's purses, and a sudden loss of consciousness before being placed perfectly back on a trail, the theory that she was bitten by a spider completely vanished. This one-of-a-kind, chilling detail, the puncture wounds that were identical to those of the previous year, and the time that had been missing from the previous year, completely destroyed the illusion that the young boy had just been lost. Clearly, whatever is lurking in the shadows of Mount Shasta is not merely a physical predator, as this demonstration demonstrated. It is something that follows families from generation to generation, charts their relationships, waits in the shadows, and leaves physical marks on its victims while simultaneously erasing their memories. The timeline, the geography, and the physical anomalies did not merely contradict the official report on the lost child, rather, they completely destroyed it, thereby revealing a well-organized and terrifyingly intelligent force that uses the national park as its own personal laboratory. Following the realization of this horrifying fact, the family was compelled to examine the entire incident through a completely different and significantly more sinister lens. They were completely wrong about everything they believed they knew about that night, and the truth that was finally revealed shattered their beliefs. The little boy had not been the victim of a random, fleeting curiosity. Rather, he had been precisely targeted, lured away, and taken care of in a methodical manner by something that was aware of exactly how to take advantage of his vulnerability. One of the entities had lied. For the purpose of ensuring that the boy would walk silently into the darkness without screaming, without fighting, and without giving his family even a single second to react, it had taken the form of the one person in whom the boy had complete and utter trust. There were no broken twigs, footprints, or scent for the canine units that the initial search teams discovered because the boy was never on the forest floor. This was the reason why the initial search teams found absolutely no signs of a physical trail. His removal from the physical area had occurred almost immediately after his removal. When the grandmother's previous encounter was revealed, the weight of the evidence was completely shifted in a different direction. Not a hallucination, the other Cappy was not the result of a child's traumatic experience. The bizarre interrogation, the glowing head, and the cave riddled with purses belonging to women were all components of a real-life sequence of events that took place in the cave. The purses that were floating around on the floor of the cave were not just random debris, Rather, they were the leftover trophies or abandoned belongings of previous victims who had not been as fortunate as the boy. These victims were women who had entered these woods and never left them. The entire mystery of why the boy was discovered on a trail that had just been searched multiple times and was found to be completely intact, dry, and free of scratches was finally explained. There was no evidence that the young boy had spent 5 hours wandering through the dense briars. Throughout the entire ordeal, he was located inside of that underground cavern. The entity did not let him go because he managed to get away. Rather, it dispersed him back into the forest because he was unable to pass its examination. As soon as the child was unable to provide responses to the entity's inquiries, he became completely useless to it. It was the realization that this force possessed a sophisticated and terrifyingly intelligent method of tracking that was the most unsettling twist of all. On October 1st, it did not just happen to come across the family by chance. It had marked this particular family bloodline a year earlier when it paralyzed the grandmother and her friend, leaving those identical puncture wounds on their necks. This marks the beginning of this particular family bloodline. It recognized their names and faces, and it waited for them to return to Mount Shasta. It was aware of their personalities. When you were in the wilderness, you were not just a passive backdrop of trees and rocks. Rather, it was a highly coordinated hunting ground where the predators did not just hunt for food, they hunted for information, and they knew exactly who you were before you even set up your tent. The predator's every action becomes chillingly clear when viewed through the lens of this new and dark reality, which allows for the reconstruction of what actually occurred that night. The abduction sequence was not a chaotic crime of opportunity. Rather, it was a highly calculated and mechanical abduction sequence that was carried out by something that had a comprehensive understanding of human behavior and logistics. It was an entire year ago when the entity first intercepted the grandmother and her friend, leaving those twin puncture wounds on their necks. These wounds were most likely used to extract genetic data, track their movements, or implant a subconscious compliance. The preparation for this encounter began precisely 1 year ago. As soon as the family arrived back at the same campground on the 1st of October 2010, the entity was already waiting in the vicinity of the campground. During the process of setting up the camp, it observed their patterns and identified the weak link, which turned out to be the boy who was 3.5 years old. Twilight, the exact hour when human vision begins to deteriorate and the flickering light of a campfire creates a blinding contrast with the surrounding forest, was the precise moment that the entity waited for until it was twilight. In terms of its level of precision, the approach was cinematic. The moment the sister turned her back for 3 seconds, the entity stepped to the edge of the tree line and deployed its camouflage, projecting the familiar and trusted image of Cappy. The boy, recognizing his grandmother, bypassed his natural attack response, which would have been to fight or flee. There was no scream or cry that he let out. Rather, he simply stood up and walked into the darkness. It was because of the entity's ability to take him by the hand and move him out of the immediate area at an unfathomable speed that the tracking dogs were unable to keep up with the scent trail at the very edge of the campsite. At some point, he was either lifted off the ground or transported in a manner that did not leave any physical signature. As the boy was being transported up the steep slope of Mount Shasta, he was taken to a hidden underground vault. The cave was crawling with spiders and was littered with purses belonging to women. At that point, the entity started working toward its true objective, which was to conduct an interrogation. A technological interface that was used to scan or question the child was probably the source of the glowing head that the boy saw. It was also possible that the head was a distortion of its actual physical form. However, the entity made a significant error. It had targeted a child who was too young to provide the cognitive data or answers that it was looking for. Inadequate language skills were exhibited by the toddler, and he simply did not comprehend the questions that were being asked. As a result of the unsuccessful attempt to collect data, the entity made the decision to get rid of the asset itself. It is highly likely that the same mechanism that was used to paralyze the grandmother a year earlier was responsible for rendering the boy unconscious. Finally, it kept an eye on the search parties that were below. After waiting until a number of rescue teams had completed their sweep of a particular section of the main trail, the entity proceeded to move past the area. The entity slipped back onto the grid during the brief dark window of time that existed before the next sweep. It then carefully placed the boy, who was clean and free of scratches, into the thicket that was located directly on the shoulder of the path, and then it disappeared back into the mountain. An impossible puzzle was left behind as a result of this flawless tactical insertion, which was designed to confuse investigators and ensure that the true nature of Mount Shasta remained completely concealed. Within the aftermath of this terrifying chain of occurrences, the family was confronted with a stony and unmovable wall when it came to the possibility of legal recourse or official investigation. We did not make any arrests. There were never any suspects identified, and there were never any criminal charges brought forward. The sheriff's department simply was unable to process the boy's detailed and unchanging account within the framework of traditional law enforcement when the boy's parents attempted to bring it to the attention of the local authorities. In the eyes of the law, a case is considered to be closed the moment that a missing person is found alive and without any physical injuries. The legal system did not find any evidence of a crime scene, there was no physical evidence of a third party kidnapping the victim, and there were no footprints to follow. The testimony of a child who was 3 years old and described a glowing-headed imposter and a cave full of purses was deemed legally ineffective by the investigators. They classified the child's account as either a psychological coping mechanism or a vivid nightmare that originated from the trauma of being lost in the woods. The conclusion that was permanently stamped on the official police report was as follows. Child went astray due to parental distraction, found unharmed. This conclusion remained completely unchanged throughout the entire process. Nevertheless, despite the fact that the legal system took no action whatsoever regarding Mount Shasta, this incident is a perfect example of a more widespread and deeply unsettling pattern that has been documented across North America. This particular case is not an isolated anomaly, rather it is a textbook entry in the larger investigation into the disappearance of 411 people, which is highly controversial. When one considers the larger database of disappearances that have occurred within national parks, the absence of a legal resolution emerges as a distinguishing feature. In the course of their work, law enforcement agencies are frequently confronted with situations in which individuals disappear in the presence of witnesses, only for the subsequent investigations to reach a complete and utter stalemate due to the fact that the physical laws that govern a typical crime scene have been completely violated. Consider, for example, the situation that occurred with Eric Lewis in 2010 on Mount Rainier. In a very short amount of time, Lewis disappeared from a highly controlled environment, just like the boy who was on Mount Shasta. A heavy safety rope was used to bind him to 2 other experienced climbers who were also climbing. The rope had been severed with surgical precision, and Lewis was no longer there when his companions turned around to see what had happened. There were no footprints of someone struggling in the fresh snow, there was no blood, and there were no indications of an avalanche. It was not scattered across a slope when National Park Rangers eventually located his climbing gear. Rather, it was found tucked deep inside a treacherous, nearly inaccessible ice cave that was located 200 feet away from the main climbing route. Despite the fact that there were no footprints leading into or out of that cave, the climbing gear was found hidden deep within the cave. As was the case with the Shasta case, the authorities in charge of the investigation and the legal system were rendered completely helpless. There was never a body found, there was never any foul play that could be proven legally, and there was never any indictment that could be handed down. The files are simply filed away under the heading of unexplained accidents, which leaves the justice system completely oblivious to a predatory phenomenon that operates entirely outside the boundaries of human law. The aftermath of these cases continues to leave a devastating scar that cannot be seen by the naked eye, and it is impossible for standard police reports to capture this scar. In the case of the family that made it through the ordeal on Mount Shasta, the nightmare did not end when they packed up their tent and drove away from the mountain. In addition to this, they have a strong desire to know more about the situation. The parents were compelled to endure a toxic mixture of profound gratitude and complete and utter dread throughout their lives. Every time their son looked at a relative with a slightly vacant gaze, or every time the wind howled through the trees outside their suburban home, they were reminded that something out there had mapped their family bloodline. This was a constant reminder that something had been there all along. A fragmented and profoundly unsettling memory was something that the young boy carried with him throughout his childhood. He had an unconscious aversion to the dark and an acute and unexplainable aversion to anyone who looked a little bit too much like his grandmother. There is a palpable sense of paranoia that permeates the community of hikers and park rangers who are aware of the genuine, unredacted details contained within these files. The companions of Eric Lewis were left to face the rest of their lives with the crushing weight of the impossible. This was the situation that they found themselves in on Mount Rainier. How is it possible to look a man's wife and children in the eye and tell them that he disappeared from the middle of a safety line that was locked? What is the best way to explain to a family that is in mourning that his equipment was discovered in perfect condition deep within an ice cave that had not been explored and was completely untouched, as if it had been transported there by an unseen hand? The remaining climbers not only suffered the loss of a friend, but they also suffered a loss of faith in the elementary laws that govern reality. As a foreboding warning to the close-knit climbing community, the case files continue to be open but frozen. This serves as a reminder that when the mountain decides to take you, your expertise, top-tier gear, and steel cables are of no consequence. The stories that have been told here are only a small sample of the thousands of strange occurrences that are hidden deep within the wilderness of our national parks. The fact that the vast, beautiful expanses of nature that we visit for sanctuary are actually ancient, highly coordinated hunting grounds is a terrifying possibility that they force us to confront. Due to the fact that the alternative is too monstrous to admit, the authorities will continue to check the boxes, file the paperwork, and attribute these disappearances to simple slips, sudden storms, or attacks by wildlife. They are unable to protect you from a predator that can imitate the voice of your mother, distort your perception of time, and pull you off the side of a mountain without leaving a single footprint in the snow. When you leave the paved roads and venture into the deep, untamed woods, you are entering a domain that does not operate according to the rules that humans have established. Long before we arrived, the ancient trees and the deep, dark caverns had already been there, and they are very good at keeping their secrets to themselves. Consequently, the next time you are sitting around a campfire, watching the embers die down as the twilight bleeds into pitch-black night, pay close attention to the shadows that are just beyond the tree line. If you hear a loved one calling your name from a location where they could not possibly be, or if you see a familiar face waving at you from the darkness, consider the possibility that they are looking for you. Don't venture out into the darkness. While you are praying that whatever is watching you from the woods decides that you are not the asset it is looking for, you should turn your back on it and stoke the fire. It was just after midnight, specifically around 12:30 in the morning on August 9th, 2013, when Kyle Lawson was woken up by his cell phone ringing. He was in bed with his wife at their home in San Angelo, Texas, and the sound cut right through the quiet of the night. Kyle groggily reached for the phone, squinting at the screen in the darkness. The caller ID showed it was his younger brother, 26-year-old Brandon. That was a little strange, a call this late, but he answered it. Kyle put the phone to his ear, but before he could even get a hello out, Brandon's voice came through, frantic and rushed. He said he needed help right now. And then he launched into a story that sounded completely unbelievable. Brandon told Kyle that he was driving his truck north on Highway 277. Now, this highway is a classic West Texas road, just 2 lanes stretching out into what feels like a whole lot of nothing. It's desolate, especially in the middle of the night. There aren't many lights, not much traffic, just open, empty country. And according to Brandon, he wasn't alone out there. He said there were 3 men and they were chasing him. To make things worse, he told Kyle that his truck was about to run out of gas. He was on fumes. His voice was high-pitched with panic. He was practically begging Kyle. He needed him to bring a gas can out to him to meet him somewhere along the highway so he could refuel and get away from these guys who were on his tail. He stressed that Kyle had to be secretive about it, that he couldn't let the other men see him. As Kyle listened to all of this, lying there in his bed, he wasn't really feeling scared for his brother. At least, not in the way Brandon wanted him to be. He wasn't picturing a high-speed chase with dangerous men. Instead, Kyle's main feeling was just deep, heavy annoyance. He was almost certain that there were no 3 men. He was sure that his brother Brandon was just high again and was having a paranoid, drug-induced hallucination. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. You see, Brandon had a history with methamphetamine. It was a struggle he'd been fighting for a while. For the past 6 months, he'd actually been doing really well. He'd been clean, he was working hard, and he was trying to be a better partner to his fiancée, Ledessa, and a better father to his 4 young children. He seemed to be turning a corner, and the whole family was proud of him. But just 2 days before this late-night phone call, Brandon had called Kyle for a very different reason. He had asked Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Kyle, of course, didn't give him any information. He did the opposite. He pleaded with his brother, telling him, "Don't do it, man. You're doing so good. You're clean. Don't throw it all away." But Kyle had a sinking feeling that his words hadn't gotten through. He was pretty sure that even though he hadn't helped, Brandon had found a way to get drugs anyway. Because ever since that phone call 2 days ago, Brandon's behavior had been erratic and unpredictable. He just wasn't acting like himself. In fact, the only reason Brandon was even out on Highway 277 at this hour was because he'd gotten into a huge fight with Ledessa. Kyle knew this because he'd spoken to his parents earlier in the evening. The plan was for Brandon to drive to their parents' house to cool off for the night, to get some space. He was essentially in a timeout for his bad behavior at home. So him being on this specific road at this specific time made sense in that context. But the story about being chased by 3 men, that part didn't make sense at all. Not in the real world, anyway. So, Kyle knew his brother was almost certainly high. And he also knew that trying to reason with him in this state was a waste of time. Telling him, "Brandon, there's no one chasing you, you're just high, you need to go to mom and dad's house," would be pointless. Brandon wouldn't hear it. He was in his own reality right now. So Kyle shifted his strategy. He didn't argue. He just tried to calm his brother down, to soothe the panic in his voice. He used a low, steady tone, trying to be the anchor in Brandon's storm. But it wasn't working. Brandon didn't calm down. If anything, he got more agitated, more anxious. He kept talking about the 3 men, saying they were getting closer, that he was running out of time. The desperation in his voice was escalating with every word. Finally, Kyle just had to ask the question that was hanging in the air. He said, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed? Is that what's happening here?" As Kyle expected, Brandon completely denied it. He swore up and down that he was not high, that this was real, that he was in serious trouble. He went right back to begging Kyle to come help him to bring the gas can so he could escape. "Please, Kyle, you have to hurry. They're gonna get me. Just bring the gas. Please, man, come on." At this point, Kyle felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. There was no point in continuing this conversation. Part of him just wanted to hang up the phone, roll over, and go back to sleep. He had his own life, his own family, his own responsibilities. He was a husband and a father. He couldn't spend his life babysitting his younger brother through self-inflicted crises. But at the same time, underneath the frustration, Kyle loved his brother. They were very close. And even though he was 99% sure there was no real danger from these imaginary men, there was still a tiny sliver of doubt. And what if Brandon was in danger from himself? What if he crashed his truck or wandered off into the dark? Kyle sighed. He knew what he had to do. He made a decision. He told Brandon, "Okay, I'm on my way. I'll be right there." Then he hung up the phone. About 45 minutes later, Kyle was driving north on that same dark and empty highway, 277. His wife was in the passenger seat next to him, and their 4-year-old son was asleep in his car seat in the back. His wife had insisted on coming. She hadn't wanted him going out alone in the middle of the night to deal with his brother, especially not when he was in such a strange state of mind. So now, the whole family was out on this rescue mission. As Kyle drove, he scanned the darkness on both sides of the road. This part of Texas is wide open. Even at night, you can see for a long way. The landscape is mostly flat plains, dotted with some low shrubs and a few small trees. It's the kind of place where a set of headlights or taillights would be visible for miles. It would be very easy to spot another vehicle. But Kyle saw nothing. There were no other cars. There was no truck that looked like Brandon's. There was certainly no sign of 3 other men in pursuit. The road was completely empty. He just kept driving, peering out into the darkness, checking the fields on either side just in case Brandon had somehow veered off the road. That seemed like a real possibility given the state he was in. But there was nothing. Then, finally, way up ahead, he saw it. A dark shape parked on the shoulder, half on the pavement and half on the dirt. It was a truck. The lights were off. It wasn't running. It was just sitting there, silent in the night. As Kyle got closer, he could see that it was his brother's truck. He'd found him. Kyle pulled his own car over to the opposite side of the road and parked. He turned to his wife and told her to stay in the car with their son, to lock the doors. He said he was just going to go over and talk to Brandon. In his mind, he was picturing Brandon sitting in the driver's seat, high as a kite, waiting for him. He figured he'd have a firm talk with him, get him to go to their parents' house, and this whole bizarre night would be over. The fact that there were no other cars around just confirmed his theory. The 3 men were a fantasy. But when Kyle walked across the highway and got to Brandon's truck, he peered through the driver's side window and his heart dropped a little. There was no one inside. The truck was empty. Brandon was gone. This didn't make any sense. Kyle was confused. On the entire drive out there, Brandon had been calling him repeatedly, call after call, his voice getting more and more frantic. "Hurry up, Kyle! You gotta get here! They're gaining on me! Bring the gas, man! I'm in trouble!" And now, Kyle was finally here, standing right next to the truck, and his brother was nowhere to be found. He hadn't said on the phone that he was leaving the truck. Where could he possibly have gone? Kyle started looking around the immediate area. He even crouched down and looked under the truck, feeling a bit ridiculous. Was his brother hiding? As he was standing there, trying to process this strange scene, his phone rang again. It was Brandon. Kyle, now deeply annoyed and confused, answered it with a sharp, "Brandon, where are you?" Brandon's voice came back, calm for the first time that night. He just said, "Bro, I'm right here." Kyle looked around wildly. "No, you're not. I don't see you. Your truck is here, but you're not." But just as he said that, Kyle saw a pair of headlights coming down the highway toward them. The vehicle was slowing down. As it got closer, he could see the light bar on the roof. It was a police car. A sheriff's deputy was pulling up to the scene. And as this was happening, as the police car was rolling to a stop right in front of him, Brandon's voice came through the phone with an urgent whisper. "Run away from that cop." In that split second, Kyle realized something important. Brandon had to be close by. He had to be watching this whole scene unfold. He could see Kyle, he could see his truck, and he could see the deputy arriving. But Kyle was looking all around him, out into the flat, open fields, and there was simply nowhere to hide. The landscape was barren. There were a few scattered shrubs and some small trees far off in the distance, but nothing close by that could conceal a grown man. So where was he? Kyle was getting furious. This whole thing was a ridiculous game. He knew why Brandon wanted him to run. Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest related to a drug charge. He was trying to avoid any contact with law enforcement. Kyle was already out here in the dead of night with his family in the car, trying to help his brother who was clearly not in his right mind. And now Brandon wanted him to run from the police? It was too much. Kyle was about to yell into the phone to demand that Brandon show himself, but before he could say another word, Brandon hung up. By now, the deputy had parked his cruiser and was walking over to Kyle, who was still standing next to his brother's abandoned truck. The officer introduced himself as Deputy Neal from the Coke County Sheriff's Department. He said he was responding to a 911 call from a truck driver who had reported a vehicle stranded on the side of the road. He asked Kyle if the truck belonged to him, if he was the one who needed help. Kyle knew he should tell the truth, but the instinct to protect his brother was strong. He couldn't just tell the deputy that his brother was likely high on meth, hiding somewhere in the nearby fields, and also had a warrant for his arrest. So, he made up a story. He told the deputy that the truck belonged to his brother, and that his brother had called him saying he'd run out of gas. He suggested that Brandon had probably started walking down the road to find a gas station. He then asked the deputy if it would be okay if he and his family just drove up and down the road a bit to look for Brandon. Surprisingly, Deputy Neal seemed to buy it. He just said, "Yeah, that's fine." Go ahead. So Kyle walked back to his car, got in with his wife and son, and started driving farther north, away from the scene. As he drove, he kept looking in his rearview mirror. He could see Deputy Neal still parked next to Brandon's truck. Once he was sure he was far enough down the road that the deputy couldn't see him, Kyle pulled over again. He took out his phone and started calling his brother, over and over and over again, his anger growing with each unanswered call. But Brandon never picked up. At this point, it was nearly 2 a.m. Kyle's 4-year-old son in the back seat was awake and crying. He was tired and scared. Kyle's wife was exhausted. And Kyle himself had reached his limit. He looked at his wife and said, "That's it. I'm done." Brandon was an adult. He had tried to come out and help, to get him out of whatever mess this was. But if Brandon didn't want to be found, if he wanted to hide in a field and play these games, then that was on him. Kyle had a family to take care of. He was going home. He turned the car around and drove back south, right past the spot where his brother's truck was still parked. Deputy Neal was still there, standing beside it, presumably waiting for Brandon to return. Kyle didn't stop. He just kept driving, heading home to put his son and this crazy night to bed. He figured he'd hear from Brandon in the morning with some wild story to explain everything. He was frustrated, but he wasn't yet truly worried. A little while after Kyle and his family drove past, Deputy Neal decided he couldn't just wait there all night either. He'd done a quick search of Brandon's truck. There was nothing suspicious inside. But importantly, there was no phone, no wallet, and no keys. These were the things a person would take with them if they had indeed run out of gas and decided to walk for help. The story Kyle had told seemed to hold up. So, Deputy Neal figured Brandon was fine, just off on foot somewhere. He had other calls to respond to. So, he reached into the truck, turned on the hazard lights so it would be visible to other drivers, locked the doors, and then he got back in his own car and left. The next morning, around 8 o'clock, Deputy Neal drove back out to Highway 277 on his patrol. He wanted to check if Brandon had eventually made it back to his truck. But when he got to the spot, the truck was still there, sitting exactly as he had left it, its hazard lights still blinking. Now, a little bit of concern started to creep in for Deputy Neal. It was one thing to be gone for a few hours in the middle of the night. It was another to still be gone well into the next morning. It was possible something bad had happened to Brandon while he was on foot. Maybe he got lost, or fell and hurt himself, or maybe he was even hit by a car. Deputy Neal decided he needed to follow up to try and find Brandon and make sure he was okay. He drove back to the sheriff's department to look up contact information for Brandon Lawson. But as soon as he walked through the door, another employee stopped him. They told him that while he was out, the department had received a call from a woman named Ledessa, Brandon's fiancée, and the story she told was very different from the simple ran out of gas story that Kyle had given him. Ledessa explained that she and Brandon had been fighting. She confirmed that he was supposed to be driving to his parents' house to cool off on the night he disappeared. But he never made it to his parents' house. And he never came back home to her either. No one in the family had seen or heard from him since that night. They had all been calling and texting his phone, but there was no response. Brandon was officially missing. Hearing this, Deputy Neal was surprised and, frankly, pretty angry. He felt like Kyle had lied to him, that he deliberately downplayed the seriousness of the situation. His first move was to go and talk to Kyle and the rest of Brandon's family to get the full, unfiltered story. And it quickly became clear that the family hadn't been trying to hide a crime. They had been trying to protect Brandon from his warrant and from himself. They genuinely believed, just like Kyle did, that this was another drug-induced episode and that he would eventually turn up. But now that he was truly gone, their fear was real. They told the police everything they knew, including his history of drug use. They were begging the police to find him. And so, a massive search was launched. For the next 4 days, Deputy Neal led a huge effort covering the area around where Brandon's truck was found on Highway 277. They had teams on foot, they used search dogs, they even had helicopters in the air. Some of the search teams used thermal imaging cameras, which can detect body heat, making it possible to find someone even if they are hiding or unconscious. But despite scouring this vast, open area, they found absolutely nothing. No footprint, no piece of clothing, no sign of a struggle. They also interviewed people who lived or owned property in the general area. They asked if anyone had seen a man walking, or a strange truck, or maybe even the 3 men Brandon had claimed were chasing him. But no one had seen anything out of the ordinary. It was as if Brandon Lawson had simply vanished into thin air. Faced with a total lack of evidence, the authorities came to a conclusion. They believed that given Brandon's fight with his fiancée, his active arrest warrant, and the complete absence of any sign of him, he must have fled. They decided he was not a missing person in the traditional sense. He was a person who had chosen to disappear. He wasn't in the area because he had left on his own terms. And with that, the official search was called off. It seemed like an open and shut case of a man running from his problems. That is, until Ledessa, Brandon's fiancée, walked into the sheriff's station with a piece of paper that changed everything. It was August 13th, 2013, 4 days after Brandon had disappeared. The official search had just been terminated. An officer at the Coke County Sheriff's Department sat across from Ledessa, who looked distraught. She told him that she'd been so worried she had started digging into their shared cell phone records looking for any clue. And she had found something that terrified her. She slid a printed-out call log across the desk and pointed to a single entry. The officer saw that it was a record of Brandon's calls from the night he went missing. In between all the frantic calls to his brother Kyle, there was another one, made at 12:50 in the morning. Brandon had called 911. Ledessa explained why this was so chilling. Brandon was terrified of the police. He had a warrant. He would do anything to avoid them. She knew that he had even told his own brother to run from Deputy Neal that night. For him to voluntarily call 911 himself, she said, meant that he must have believed his life was in immediate mortal danger. He must have been out of all other options. It made no sense that he would call for help and then seemingly run away from it. This was a complete shock to everyone at the sheriff's department. Up until that moment, they believed the only 911 call had come from a trucker reporting a stranded vehicle. They had no idea that Brandon himself had also called for help. It turned out that the local 911 dispatch center was a small, underfunded operation. In the confusion of the night, someone had simply failed to pass along the information about Brandon's call to the responding deputies. It was a critical error. Now that they knew about it, they had to hear it. They contacted the dispatch center and got a copy of the audio recording. When they played it, a chill went down their spines. First, Brandon's voice. He did not sound like someone who had simply run out of gas. He sounded like he was in the middle of a life-or-death situation. He was breathless and panicked. But the second thing, the most disturbing thing, was that if you listened very, very closely, you could hear what sounded like another person's voice in the background, on Brandon's end of the line, right before the call disconnected. The call went like this. The dispatcher answered, 911 emergency. Brandon's voice came through, choppy and fast. Yes, I'm in the middle of a field. A state trooper is pushing guys over. Right here, going toward Abilene on both sides. His words were jumbled, hard to understand. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chased into the woods. Some guys, the dispatcher, confused, said, okay, now run that by me one more time. Brandon then seemed to be talking to someone else, not the dispatcher. He said, we're not talking to him. Then, to the dispatcher again, I accidentally ran into them. The dispatcher asked, you ran into them. Okay. Then Brandon said something truly chilling. Got the first guy. The dispatcher asked, do you need an ambulance? Brandon replied, yeah. No, I need the cops. The dispatcher tried to clarify, okay. Is anybody hurt? But there was no response. Just silence. Hello? 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 The line was dead. Suddenly, this wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This might be a homicide. The reference to being chased, the other voice, the cryptic phrase, got the first guy, it all painted a much darker picture. The search, which had just been called off, was immediately resumed, but this time it was bigger, more intense. For the next full year, law enforcement and volunteers poured countless, but they found nothing. Not a single clue. He was just gone. Eventually, the case went cold again. The authorities may have moved on, but Brandon's family never did. LaDessa hired 2 different private investigators over the years. They conducted their own extensive searches, not just around Highway 277, but all over the state, following up on any potential lead. But they also came up empty. As the years went by, Brandon's disappearance became a well-known internet mystery featured on podcasts and television shows. Theories swirled. Maybe he was just high and wandered off, falling victim to the elements or wild animals. Maybe the 3 men were real and they had kidnapped and killed him. Or maybe the original police theory was right and he had successfully started a new life somewhere else. For 9 long years, there were only questions. Then, in January of 2022, a small group of independent searchers, volunteers who had become fascinated with the case, decided to go out to Highway 277 one more time. They went back to that same area that had been searched by hundreds of people with dogs and helicopters and advanced technology. And while combing through a field right off the side of the highway, these volunteers found what all the others had missed. They found an old, weathered pair of shorts and pieces of 2 white sneakers. They immediately called the sheriff's department. Deputies arrived, secured the area, and began their own meticulous search. Not far from where the clothes were found, they discovered it. A small fragment of a human skull. The remains were sent for DNA testing, and soon the results came back. They belonged to Brandon Lawson. You would think that finding his remains would finally bring some answers. But instead, it only deepened the mystery. The location where his skull fragment was found was incredibly close to where his truck had been parked. It was in the primary search area, the very place that had been gone over with a fine-tooth comb again and again for years. How could everyone have missed it? Remember, this isn't a dense forest. It's a flat, open West Texas field. It's hard to imagine how the remains of a grown man, along with his clothing and bright white shoes, could have gone unnoticed for 9 years. So where does that leave us? We're left with two impossible-sounding scenarios. The first option is that for 9 years, hundreds of searchers, professional canine units, and helicopters with thermal cameras all somehow missed Brandon's body, which was lying right there in the open field where they were looking. That he was there the whole time, and everyone was simply blind to it. The second option is that he wasn't there. That during those initial searches, Brandon's body was somewhere else entirely. But if that's true, it raises even more questions. Where did he go after that 911 call? And, most disturbingly, how did his remains end up back in that field nearly a decade later? We can reconstruct his last known movements. He argued with Ledessa. He drove off, likely under the influence of drugs. His paranoia escalated until he believed men were chasing him. He called his brother for help. His truck ran out of gas. He got out and made a terrifying 911 call where he spoke of being chased and mentioned he got the first guy. He saw a deputy arrive and warned his brother to run. And then he vanished. 9 years later, a piece of him reappeared, almost exactly where his journey ended. The discovery of his remains gave his family a painful partial closure. They finally knew he was gone. But the how, the why, and the who, if there was a who, remain a profound and haunting mystery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.